25 years ago, Brandon Sanderson released the fantasy novel Elantris. What nobody could have expected at that time was that Elantris would be the foundation for one of the largest and most popular fantasy universes in all of fiction. Now known as the Cosmere, there are more than 20 unique novels, short stories, and graphic novels that make up this expansive universe. I was late to the Cosmere hype train. I read Mistborn 1 during my undergraduate degree, but didn't touch another Sanderson novel until I picked up The Way of Kings back during the COVID lockdowns. That scratched an itch I didn't know I had, and by year's end I had read every single story set in the Cosmere universe. And today, on the 1-year anniversary of Wind and Truth, I'm going to rank and review them all, going over what I like and dislike about every significant story set in the Cosmere. Whether you're looking for some creme posting or just want something to help you pass the time until Mistborn Era 3 comes out, we here at Mercenary Publishing are excited to present to you our thoughts on Brandon Sanderson's The Cosmere. Due to the size of this video, I debated what was the best way to approach spoilers. There are certain books in the Cosmere I don't really care to talk about in detail, while there are novels that could have honestly been YouTube videos of my own. I want to guide people who are just getting into the Cosmere to know which books to start off with, but also share my thoughts with diehard Sanderson fans who have already read every entry. What then was the best way to balance spoilers in this video? Here's how the rest of this video is structured. This section of the video is going to be the non-spoiler section, consisting of 1 to 2 minute reviews of each release in Brandon Sanderson's The Cosmere. If you're brand new to The Cosmere, if there are books you haven't read yet, or you just want a short 1-minute review, start in this section. For books you have read, use the timestamps in the video description to navigate the rest of this video without accidentally spoiling yourself. You can also click on the link in my pinned comment if you want to read specific sections of this essay without having to navigate the YouTube video. With that all cleared up, here are my short non-spoiler thoughts on every book in Brandon Sanderson's The Cosmere. Elantris is the first novel published by Brandon Sanderson. The debut novel for most writers is typically weaker than their later works, and that is true of Elantris. Even so, much of the fun of reading this book is seeing how Sanderson has grown over the years, but also seeing the seeds of the types of stories he wanted to tell. All three main characters are great, if a little simple in comparison to later Cosmere protagonists. I don't think it's the best story to start out on, but once you've read a few Cosmere novels, it is worth your time to go back and read it. Mistborn: The Final Empire is the book that truly launched Brandon Sanderson's career, and the first book many fans of the Cosmere read. Personally, I think it's just okay. It is a good introduction to the concepts and themes of the Cosmere, but I don't think it does enough to call itself either a great fantasy story or a great heist story. The characters are pretty flat apart from 1 or 2 exceptions, the pacing is pretty bad, and the ending is somewhat anticlimactic, whereas the ending is usually the best part for most Sanderson novels. Even so, most people like it more than me, so this is one of the best options to pick if you're starting off with the Cosmere. The Well of Ascension is the first sequel written by Brandon Sanderson. I think this book improves on the Final Empire in many ways, though it also suffers from some growing pains. The protagonists of this book are more interesting, and their conflicts more personal and complex. Some of the side characters that I didn't like in the first book really shine in this one. While the ending sequence isn't as bombastic as the other books in the series, the twist at the end makes it one of the better endings. Even so, The Well of Ascension suffers from a pretty boring beginning and one of the worst main antagonists in the entire Cosmere. The last book in Mistborn Era 1, The Hero of Ages, is the book that makes the trilogy worth reading. The main characters are at their best, the main antagonist is actually interesting for once, The side plots are just as good as the main plots, and the ending sequence shows why fans of the Cosmere love the Sanderlanche. I do think the pacing is still a little off, mainly because the protagonist doesn't actually do much during the middle of the plot, but while I may not have loved how Mistborn Era 1 began, I would absolutely recommend reading it because of how much I love how Mistborn Era 1 ends. Warbreaker is one of the most overlooked novels in the Cosmere, which is a shame because I think it's one of the best. Sanderson finally masters the art of romance with this book, while also providing a story that is a perfect balance between religion, politics, drama, action, and world building. One of the main characters, Lightsong, is not as interesting to follow as the others, but even he provides humor that works much better than in many of Sanderson's later novels. Warbreaker is free to read online, so make this your next Cosmere novel if you haven't read it yet. When people talk about their favorite Cosmere novel, The Way of Kings stands out as a favorite for many. It's for a good reason, because this book is absolutely fantastic. Brandon Sanderson described the Stormlight Archive as his epic fantasy series, and he absolutely delivers with a stellar cast, interesting magic, unpredictable plot, heart-wrenching moments, and some of the best moments in the entire Cosmere. It is a little hard to get into because you're not going to understand what's going on for the first 100 or so pages, but have a little patience and you'll be rewarded with one of the best fantasy novels ever written. Whereas I think Mistborn Era 1 is overrated, I go against the grain and think Mistborn Era 2 is underrated. The Alloy of Law sees Brandon Sanderson transition into pulpy steampunk fantasy and introduces us to the dynamic duo of Wax and Wayne. I think Wayne is hit or miss, but Wax has grown to be one of my favorite characters within the entire Cosmere. At a little less than 100,000 words, the Alloy of Law makes for a relatively quick and easy read. It might not be as complex or deep as Sanderson's other novels, but when it comes to pure fun, there aren't many books better in the Cosmere than this one. There are a few sequels that surpass the stories that came before. That's why Words of Radiance is so impressive, because it is the Empire Strikes Back of the Cosmere. This book takes everything the Way of King does well and improves upon it. The characters and their conflicts are more complex. The world building expands the mysteries of Roshar. While many of Sanderson's novels have predictable endings, there are few stories as exciting as the climax of Words of Radiance. While many are mixed on the books that follow it, the Stormlight Archive is absolutely worth getting into with the amazing 1-2 punch of The Way of Kings and Words of Radiance. Whereas Mistborn Era 1 gets progressively better with each novel, Mistborn Era 2 does get progressively worse the further you go into the series. Shadows of Self does have a more intriguing plotline and antagonist compared to the previous novel, but the actual climax of the story and Wax's character arc isn't as satisfying I hoped it would be. While not every novel needs to be action-packed, Shadows of Self does meander a lot, leaving you feeling like not much happened by story's end. Sanderson tried his hand at a political thriller with Shadows of Self. He did a good job, but he didn't knock it out of the park like he did with the Alloy of Law. What happens when Brandon Sanderson writes an Indiana Jones story? You get a pretty good adventure in the Bands of Mourning, though only if you look past the boring, stupid antagonists and the hunt for one of the worst plot MacGuffins in the entire Cosmere. One of the main draws of Mistborn Era 2 is the budding relationship between Wax and Steris. Their relationship is my favorite romance in the entire Cosmere, and The Bands of Mourning is the book that really hones in on what makes them such a great couple. That I wish The Bands of Mourning was less of an adventure novel and more of a romance is the best backhanded compliment I can give it. Arcanum Unbounded is a collection of short stories and novellas written across Brandon Sanderson's career. While I think he is a great novelist, I don't think he is a good short story writer. There isn't a single story in this collection that I would rate higher than a 6, and it also features Edgedancer, which is one of my least favorite stories set within the Cosmere. I don't even think The Emperor's Soul or Mistborn's Secret History are that good, despite their popularity among fans. Unless you're a Cosmere completionist, I would recommend you just skip reading Arcanum Unbounded. Oathbringer is the midpoint of the Stormlight Archive Era 1, which is also how I would describe its overall quality. There are great things about Oathbringer, but it is also the book that introduces some big problems with the Stormlight Archive. The biggest letdown for this novel is the way the climax is handled. Sanderson attempted his biggest battle yet within the Cosmere, and it came off as very messy and unsatisfying to read. I would probably rank this book even lower on my list, but Oathbringer looks like a Pulitzer Prize winner in comparison to the next two stories set within the Stormlight Archive. Screw Risen, screw The Sleepless, screw everything about this novella Dawnshard. This is the single worst story in the Cosmere, with some of the most annoying characters that Brandon Sanderson has ever written. Some of my friends who have read this book finds its depictions of disability to be grossly offensive, and while I wouldn't go that far, I do think this book is a poor representation of people with physical disabilities and mental health struggles. I hate this story, and would throw it in the trash and never touch it again, if it wasn't so important in expanding the lore of the Cosmere Dawnshards. Oh, let me count the ways why Rhythm of War is creme. The pacing is terrible. Several interesting side characters are made into some of the most boring main characters in the Cosmere. The entire story comes off as just setup for the real conclusion of the first era of the Stormlight Archive, Wind and Truth. This book is so bad, I'm going to one day make a video dedicated to it and explain why its depiction of suicidal depression is extremely problematic. If Words of Radiance is the case study that demonstrates how to make a good sequel, then Rhythm of War is the case study that demonstrates all the ways a sequel can go wrong. The action-packed conclusion to Mistborn Era 2, The Lost Metal, doesn't match the highs of The Hero of Ages. Even so, The Lost Metal is a great send-off to the characters living during this time period on Scadrial. What are its problems? Well, the story is so plot-heavy and needs to wrap up so many individual character storylines, it doesn't offer much in terms of themes or thoughtful commentary like with other Cosmere stories. Mistborn Era 2 suffered from a lack of a good era villain, and that is especially true when it comes to how the antagonist of this book is handled. However, unlike with the ending of Stormlight Archive Era 1, I was left genuinely excited to see how the Mistborn story would continue upon reaching the end of The Lost Metal. White Sand is the first and only graphic novel set within the Cosmere so far. It is an amazing story, but is held back by the format in which it is told. Sanderson's lack of experience with the graphic novel format shows with this story, which is unfortunate because of how good it is. An amazing cast, a great and unpredictable plot, and a cool setting all make for a story so great, I'm mad there is no plans for a White Sand sequel in the immediate future. The good news is that Brandon Sanderson intends to write a prose version of this story one day, and if it follows the plot of this comic, then the White Sand novel will be one of the best books set within the Cosmere. How we ultimately feel about a story is subjective, and Tress of the Emerald Sea is proof of it. I understand the story Sanderson wanted to tell. I understand why others loved this book. I understand what Tress is going for, and yet I still dislike it. Tress of the Emerald Sea is a gender-flipped version of The Princess Bride, which I think is one of the best movies ever made. Unfortunately, Sanderson changed so much in translation that I was left with a bad taste reading this book. Like mint ice cream that is white instead of green, there aren't any big objective issues with this book, but enough has been changed about the story that I just spent the whole time thinking how I would rather read or watch The Princess Bride instead of reading Tress of the Emerald Sea. Here's my hot take. I think Yumi and the Nightmare Painter is the best novel that Brandon Sanderson has ever written. It is basically a remixed retelling of Final Fantasy X, but unlike Tress of the Emerald Sea, I think Yumi greatly improves upon the source material. Part mystery, part romance, and part commentary on what is the true nature of art, the entire secret project endeavor was worth it, if only because this book came out because of it. You can guess at all the book plot twists if you know the inspirations for this book. To the point it does feel like Sanderson is flirting with plagiarism. However, it is said that great artists steal, and Yumi and the Nightmare Painter proves why artists should not only steal, but do it more. Sanderson flirted with westerns when he wrote Mistborn Era 2, but The Sunlit Man is the first true western set within the Cosmere. This is a pretty great story, with only two big problems. The first issue is that the antagonist is terrible, a trend that has plagued Sanderson's most recent stories. But the bigger issue is the choice of the main character, because the protagonist of this book is simultaneously the reason why the book works so well, and also the reason why Wind and Truth felt underwhelming. Looking back, I think it was a mistake to publish this book before Wind and Truth, because the Sunlit Man story spoils certain aspects of the Stormlight Archive I didn't want to know going into the end of Stormlight Era 1. With both books now released, I think you can follow the proper reading order and enjoy the Sunlit Man after you get through Wind and Truth. Wind and Truth is the end of the Stormlight Archive Era 1, and perhaps the most controversial book Sanderson has written within the Cosmere. That's why you might be amused to know that I'm pretty ambivalent towards this novel. I do think this is a good book, and a fitting conclusion to the first half of the Stormlight Archive. However, while there isn't a major flaw with the story, all of Sanderson's worst writing habits are on full display with this book. Worst of all, it doesn't do much to excite me for the future of the Stormlight Archive, which might be a blessing in disguise, since it'll probably be close to a decade before we get Stormlight 6. Isles of the Emberdark is the newest release in the Cosmere as of this video's publication. Does it feel like Moana fanfiction? Sure, but Sanderson offers a pretty fun and interesting take by infusing Polynesian culture into this expansion of his previously published short story, Sixth of the Dusk. That being said, the secondary protagonist of this story, Starling, is nowhere near as interesting as the leading man, Sixth of the Dusk. While it might not be the most consequential Cosmere book, or feel that deep when compared to other Sanderson stories, this was still a great read and a good appetizer for what will come next, the long-awaited Mistborn Era 3. And that concludes the non-spoiler reviews of this video. You now have two options, Mercenary. If you want to hear my broad thoughts on Brandon Sanderson's series as a whole, you can use the timestamps to skip to the end of the video. Otherwise, this is your last warning. The next section of this video will discuss every major story set within the Cosmere in detail. See you on the other side, Mercenary. Going back to read the first work of a published writer is always nerve-wracking. To quote a famous clone captain, experience outranks everything. It is a rare thing to find a person whose first work is their very best, and that rule holds for Brandon Sanderson. Elantris does not rank among the best novels set in the Cosmere, but I was glad to find that Elantris was very good. At the very least, I actually liked it better than the book that typically gets recommended to people to start their foray into the Cosmere, but we'll talk about that later. The premise of Elantris is that there was once a city called Elantris, from which the book takes its name. In this city lived a race of superhumans with magical abilities that they used to heal others and achieve works of wonder, until one day they all suddenly lost their powers. The people of Elantris are from then on cursed with immortality that won't allow them to die, but any wound or pain they suffer will not leave them either. Elantris follows the story of 3 characters, each of which are interesting in their own ways. The first and primary protagonist of the book is Prince Raoden. He is next in line to become king of his home country of Erelon, only to wake up one morning and find that he has become an Elantrian. Exiled and cast into the damned city of Elantris, he makes the most of his situation and tries to solve the mystery of why Elantris fell. The second protagonist is Princess Serene. She was betrothed to Raoden and had come to Erelon to marry him, only to learn that he died on her way over. Now a dowager princess, she decides to remain in Erelon with hopes of improving things under the poor rule of the king, while investigating some strange happenings taking place in Erelon's dark underbelly. Lastly, the third and most interesting of the 3 protagonists is Ghyran Rathan. A high priest of the Shu-Dereth religion, he comes to Erelon with the hope of converting the people. However, he must do so quickly, for conversion is the only thing that will stop the Fjordell Empire from invading and destroying the kingdom of Erelon. Now, part of the reason why I like Elantris so much isn't actually because of the story itself. The plotline is good, the mysteries are fun to uncover, and like most Cosmere novels, the finale is bombastic and epic. The best and worst aspect of Elantris is that it's the seed to something bigger. There aren't really any unique themes to Elantris that you won't find in his other works. Everything that Sanderson does with Elantris, he does better in other Cosmere books. But there's a whole lot of fun in going back and seeing Sanderson's first try at so many things he's come to be known for. Raoden's plot is a story about the value of leadership and maintaining hope in a hopeless situation, along with the importance of following scientific study and pursuit of knowledge. Serene is the prototypical, headstrong, spunky female protagonist that Sanderson would come to improve upon with Marasi and Shallan. As for Hrathen, Sanderson's love and struggles with religion are on fully display here, and you wouldn't get his conflict with religion in the Stormlight Archives if it weren't for the work done here in Elantris. The most surprising thing about Elantris, however, is actually its tone. Sanderson has talked about how his first couple works were darker and grittier than he would have liked, a result of him trying to get published in an industry that at the time wanted harder, grimmer books like A Game of Thrones. If most works in the Cosmere are a soft PG-13, then Elantris is a hard PG-13, even R-rated in some scenes. In short, this was a great book to read. I do think it works as an entry point to the Cosmere, but I think it actually works much better to go back and read after you finish the Stormlight Archive or Mistborn Era 1. There are going to be 2 novels on this list whose rankings are going to be pretty controversial. This is one of them. The first time I read a book by Brandon Sanderson was in 2017. I attended Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah for my undergraduate degree. In case you weren't aware, that is also where Brandon attended college, and also where he currently teaches his creative writing classes. We're also members of the same religion, and let me tell you, you can't talk to a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who likes to read books without someone bringing up the name Brandon Sanderson. So after being badgered for years to read his books, I finally read his most recommended novel, Mistborn: The Final Empire. Do you want to know why I didn't read anything more from him until years later? Because I was frankly underwhelmed by this book. I have since reread The Final Empire 2 more times since my first go-around, and think higher of it these days, but I still can't bring myself to call this a great book. Before anything else, we need to talk about the premise, or rather, the 2 premises, because among the issues I have with Brandon Sanderson, this is one of the biggest. When Brandon Sanderson pitches The Final Empire, he explains that it is a story about what happens after the evil villain wins. What does the world look like if Sauron had gotten the One Ring back, or if Voldemort had beaten Harry Potter? How do heroes rise up after evil has taken over the entire world? That is the background of the heist story of the Final Empire. Or rather, that's how Brandon pitches it. But the truth is that this is neither a story about overthrowing an evil overlord, nor is it even a heist story. Without going too deep into spoilers, the Final Empire doesn't deliver on either of these premises. This isn't really a book about rebellion, nor is it really a heist story. The best way I can describe the Final Empire is as Sanderson's first real attempt at a romantasy adventure. Once again, Brandon Sanderson has picked 3 protagonists to serve as the principal characters of this novel. The primary protagonist is Vin, a bastard to one of the leading nobles of the Empire who grew up as a street urchin. Vin is a Mistborn, a powerful being who can make use of every type of allomancy, the metal-based magical arts that are at the basis of the Mistborn series. The second main character is Kelsier. You might have heard of him because he actually appeared in Fortnite back in 2021. Kelsier is the leader of the main rebellion against the Lord Ruler and the evil empire on Scadrial. It is he who recruits Vin, instructing her in the ways of allomancy and setting up much of the plot of the novel. The third and final principal protagonist is Elend Venture, a son of one of the leading noble houses. He provides a viewpoint of those within the Empire who are trying to change it from within, the hope to remake the kingdom without having to violently overthrow it. Oh, Elend will also become Vin's love interest, the consequences of which will prove to change not just them, but the entire world of Scadrial. So what are my problems with the Final Empire? While I'm not so hot on the main storyline, my biggest issue is with the main star of this tale, Vin. Sanderson talked about how the Final Empire was originally his attempt at writing a more grimdark fantasy, only for him to pull back. The decision to do so worked great with Kelsier, who is one of the most interesting characters Sanderson has ever written. But Vin is just too boring. Most of the Final Empire is not so much a story about fighting the evil empire or carrying out a grand Ocean's 11 style heist, but a story about how a young street rat comes to be a real person. The Final Empire isn't so much a tale of two cities as it is Oliver Twist, just with a focus on gaining powers and the revolution against the Empire serving as the motivation and backdrop for the plot of the novel. This in itself wouldn't be that bad, but the pacing of the novel and Vin's character development suffers as a result. Brandon Sanderson is well regarded for his world building, and with the Final Empire he's shown his brilliance when it comes to making exciting worlds and cool magic systems. But unlike his later work, good portions of the novel do feel like they're included not really to advance the plot or character development, but to just show off this strange world Sanderson has made we know and love as Scadrial. Speaking of love, much of the book's plot is spent on developing the romantic relationship between Vin and Elend. Does it work? Kind of. I'm a huge fan of romance in stories, to the point I think they're rather vital across most genres of fiction. But you can tell that this is an earlier book in Sanderson's career, because I don't buy the romantic relationship that develops between Vin and Elend as easily as I do with later books in the series. That is in large part to do with the character writing. Vin is boring, but I do enjoy her overall character arc in this book. Elend, on the other hand, is tedious and annoying, but I also think that's part of his character and an important part of his development across this series. Even so, I wished he had died instead of other characters by the end of the novel the first time I read it, though that is a tune I would quickly change once I read the sequel. But it's really the third act where things fall apart. Have you ever watched a movie in the Oceans series? Heck, have you ever watched a Mission Impossible movie? Here's how a heist story is supposed to work. The main character assembles a crew, who then come up with a plan to steal something. The crew then executes the plan across Act 2 and Act 3, which the conflict and drama in the story coming from the unexpected developments that forces the main crew to adapt. The Final Empire fails because it spends the first couple acts of the story building up the plan and the crew, then failing to follow through on either of them. Elend getting captured and then convincing Kelsier to save him, leading to Kelsier getting killed, was an unexpected plot twist. But I wouldn't say it was a good one, because at that point the story completely goes off the rails. All of the careful planning for the big heist? Useless. How about the crew that Kelsier assembled to carry out his big plan? Pretty much irrelevant to how the final battle with the Lord Ruler plays out. Brandon Sanderson is both well regarded and criticized for what fans call the Sanderlanche. Brandon sets up dominoes in each of his novels, only to hit the critical moment where he knocks all of them down. The Sanderlanche is where most of the action and important plot development happens or gets resolved, and in most books that works well. That's not the case with the Final Empire. The way things play out is a bad climax to the story, and considering Sanderson has retconned this climax not once, but twice, it's clear from his actions that he agrees with me in some regard. Even so, I do think it serves as a solid foundation for the rest of the Mistborn series, and I do think there are great moments in the book, even if I don't love the overall package. Congratulations! You've defeated the evil overlord. Now what? That is the premise of the Well of Ascension, and for the most part, it delivers. The first true sequel published by Brandon Sanderson, The Well of Ascension is a monumental book within the Cosmere for several different reasons. The first and most important thing it does is prove that Sanderson can write sequels. Many great writers out there have solid enough ideas for one book, but only half of them are able to publish a sequel that matches or surpasses the first. For me, I think The Well of Ascension is a clear improvement over the Final Empire, though not without problems of its own. The second aspect of The Well of Ascension that is vitally important to talk about is that this is the first real novel in the series that focuses on the shards and their interactions with humanoid life in the Cosmere. One of my favorite aspects of the Cosmere is the shards of Adonalsium, fragments of power that help people become godlike beings that create the various worlds of the Cosmere. But to focus more specifically on the Well of Ascension, the death of Kelsier means that most of the book is focused on returning protagonists, Vin and Elend, while also giving more attention to the supporting cast from the first book. Whereas I felt the members of Kelsier's crew were one-note and caricatures in the first book, many of them really come into their own in this one. Several of these side characters do die by the story's end, and I genuinely felt saddened by their deaths, especially given the impact it has on the characters who survive. Speaking of which, Elend goes from being the least interesting protagonist in the first book to the most interesting one in the Well of Ascension. Brandon Sanderson has wrestled with politics in each of his books before, but this is the first one that shows he has some really interesting things to say about the nature of rule. What is the balance of doing what is good for the people and allowing them freedom to live as they see fit? How should power be shared? To what lengths do you go to fix the problems left behind by those who ruled before? These are just a few of the questions that Elend has to wrestle with, going from a young idealist to an effective ruler and remarkable character study. But there's still a huge problem I have with The Well of Ascension that keep it from being an amazing book, and once again it has to do with Vin. Well, Vin and the new principal antagonist of the novel, the assassin and Elend's half-brother, Zane. Within the Cosmere there are two notable love triangles that develop with a female protagonist. One of them works out great in the Stormlight archives, but in this book, much of the Well of Ascension has to deal with the love triangle between Vin, Elend, and Zane, and it is nowhere near as effective as it is with Kaladin, Shallan, and Adolin. There are several reasons why the romantic aspects of this book don't work. First, it's obvious from the start that Vin is going to end up with Elend. It would have been cool to see Vin try to redeem Zane and fix him, but Sanderson never showed himself to be willing to go that far against the grain. It wasn't a situation like in the Stormlight archives, where you are constantly wondering just who Shalong will ultimately choose to be her spouse and lover. But the bigger problem is that, once again, Sanderson is still developing his character writing skills in the Well of Ascension. Zane Venture is a one-note psychopath, and while you can write crazy characters and make them interesting, Zane simply isn't a good antagonist. He isn't even interesting as a romantic interest for Vin, because there isn't really a good reason for her to be attracted to him beyond Zane being a bad boy. Fortunately, Zane gets killed by the end of the second act, taking one of the Cosmere's most lackluster villains off of the board. Even so, whereas the finale to The Final Empire underwhelmed, The Well of Ascension features one of the best third act Sanderson avalanches in the entire Cosmere. Ergo, though The Well of Ascension still has problems, including a very dull intro that is a slog to get through for the first act, I ultimately walked away from this book liking it even more than its predecessor. Mistborn Era 1 comes to an end in spectacular fashion in The Hero of Ages. When people talk about how much they love Mistborn Era 1, I tend to assume that most of that love comes from how it ends. Because among the works of Brandon Sanderson, and especially among his finales, The Hero of Ages ranks among his best. The premise of The Hero of Ages is a reflection on the nature of prophecies, legends, and, as the title suggests, heroes. The ending of The Well of Ascension revealed that the prophecies the main cast has been following were lies, that the truth had been manipulated by the powerful entity known as Ruin to help him escape his imprisonment. Vin wasn't acting as the prophesied hero that would save the world, but instead wound up being the principal agent that might have brought about the end of Scadrial. Meaning that for the first time in the entire Mistborn series, at least for me, Vin is finally an interesting character. Her character arc is finally impactful, and for the first time in the series, she shows some real, genuine agency. Vin is little more than Kelsier's tool in Book 1, and much of who she is in Book 2 is decided by Elend, Zane, and the prophecies in Book 2. In Book 3, you really get the sense that the Vin you encounter in this book is the true Vin that's been in hiding throughout the series. Which makes the finale mostly great. I knew some of the main characters were going to die, because that is how things played out in The Final Empire and The Well of Ascension. However, Vin and Elend both dying wasn't on my bingo card going into The Hero of Ages. That Sanderson not only had the courage to do it, but also gave their deaths some real weight instead of being some sort of cheap send-off is impressive. As much as I complained about how their journeys began, I love how the stories of Vin and Elend came to an end. Speaking of which, The Hero of Ages is also great when it comes to handling two other important side characters, Sazed and Spook. To start with Sazed, he began the series as a religious scholar and advisor to the main company of characters. In The Well of Ascension, Sazed lost his faith after the death of Tindwyl and the discovery that the prophecies were all lies. To make The Hero of Ages a story about him regaining his faith in himself, in life, and in religion, only to become the new god of Scadrial and taking upon himself the role of harmony? The Hero of Ages cements Sazed as one of the best characters in the entire Cosmere. And then there's Spook. When I first encountered Spook in The Final Empire, I wrote him off as one of Sanderson's worst characters. I hated the way he talked, and the fact that he was included seemingly just to show off Sanderson's quirky sense of humor drove me nuts. Spook was the scrappy do of the Cosmere, and the less I saw of him, the better. So imagine my surprise when I finished The Hero of Ages and decided that Spook was the best character in the novel. Not Vin, not Elend, not Sazed, but Spook. Everyone has certain story tropes that they love more than others, and one of my favorites is the examination of people trying to live up to the legend made up about them. It works great in the Metal Gear Solid series, it works great in Star Wars, and it's why The Hero of Ages is such a fantastic novel. So what are my problems with The Hero of Ages? The main issue is, once again, the pacing. More than any other book in Mistborn Era 1, and really more than almost any other book in the Cosmere except for Wind and Truth, most of the important plot beats and developments don't really happen until the third act of The Hero of Ages. The book really spins its wheels in Act 1, and Act 2 is more interesting for what is going on with Spook and the other side characters, while Vin wafts about. The only other issue with The Hero of Ages is that there really isn't a good antagonist in this novel, which means it again suffers from the same problem as every other novel in Mistborn Era 1. Ruin is interesting, but he also comes off as far more one-note than other shards do later in the series. It seems that Vin's oft-mentioned brother might finally make a real appearance, but it turns out just to be an illusion from Ruin. Marsh and the other Inquisitors serve as good physical obstacles, but since they're being puppeteered by Ruin, they aren't that interesting as antagonists either. Even so, Sanderson really roughed out the edges and delivered on the promise of Mistborn Era 1 with The Hero of Ages. While I might not love Mistborn the Final Empire as much as the average Sanderson fan, I highly recommend it if only because it's a necessary step to get to The Hero of Ages, the highest praise I can think of for this novel. Warbreaker is very much the odd duck among the works of the Cosmere. It was the last standalone novel that Sanderson wrote until the release of his secret projects, meaning it was the only standalone novel for 14 years. Sanderson published much of the story online as it was written, a story that was largely influenced by his blossoming relationship with his now wife Emily. You can still read the final completed edition entirely for free, which means it hasn't gotten the same promotion from its publisher as other books within the Cosmere. Which is a shame, because I think this is a genuinely great book. The story of Warbreaker primarily focuses on two sisters, Ciri and Vivenna. Vivenna has been raised her entire life with the purpose of being sent off to marry the God King of Halandren, a union that should hopefully prevent the invasion of her kingdom. However, at the last second, her younger sister, the more rebellious Ciri, is sent instead. With both of their lives taking an unexpected turn, they each must adapt to their change in circumstances, their choices ultimately deciding the fate of the world of Nalthis. The best part of Warbreaker is that Sanderson has finally written a great, intriguing, and wholly believable romance with Ciri and the God King Suzebron. Whether it's because of all the feedback he's gotten from his other books, or because of the real-world romantic experience he got from dating, falling in love, and marrying, Warbreaker marks a turning point in the Cosmere where most of the romantic relationships are far more enjoyable to read compared to the romances that were depicted before Warbreaker. I do think Sanderson is hit or miss when it comes to his female protagonists, but having the two sisters against each other made them some of Sanderson's better characters. They still aren't as fully rounded out as some of the female characters that are featured in the Stormlight archives, but they do feel more fleshed out compared to Vin or Serene. The secondary characters, especially Vasher, are also genuinely interesting to follow. The humor is great in this novel, the pacing is fantastic, and the reveal of the real villains all make for one of Sanderson's better stories. So are there any big issues with Warbreaker? I think the book's biggest problem is that it is actually a stealth sequel to Elantris, and it probably would have been even more satisfying to just set both stories on the same planet and continuity. The Cosmere being an interconnected universe is both its greatest strength and weakness, depending on the book and the story that's going on. This is largely because Sanderson wants to have the books connected to each other, but he also doesn't want to make them so interconnected that you can't read them independently. Thematically, Warbreaker is an evolution and commentary on Elantris. Elantris is the story of fallen gods searching to regain their power, while Warbreaker is a story of empowered gods rendered impotent by politics and their own follies. Elantris is a bleak and colorless story, while Warbreaker is dominated by colors. Elantris features a princess who is given away in an arranged marriage to protect her kingdom, and Warbreaker features a princess who is given away in an arranged marriage to protect her kingdom. Warbreaker is, for all intents and purposes, Elantris 2.0. Which wouldn't be such a problem, but Brandon Sanderson has promised both an Elantris trilogy and a Warbreaker follow-up in the past. At the end of the video, I'm going to discuss the greatest strengths and weaknesses of the Cosmere, but here is a preview of one of my biggest complaints. Sanderson doesn't know how to compress his own series. Whether it be plot lines or characters or magic systems or anything he writes about, one of his worst habits is that he spreads himself out too thin instead of combing things to make them stronger. Take Lightsong, for instance. He is a funny character in this book, and one of the principal protagonists, but he really isn't that instrumental to the plot until the climax. His character arc could have been better served if it was combined with some of the other secondary characters, very few of whom I can even remember by name. Frankly, I barely remembered Lightsong was a character until I reviewed a summary of Warbreaker, and I doubt he pops up in the thoughts of other fans of the Cosmere. Even so, the issues with Warbreaker aren't so much that there is anything deeply wrong with it, but mostly that a few tweaks and decisions could have made it perfect. For that reason, Warbreaker is one of my favorite novels in the Cosmere, and one that I highly recommend you check out if it is one of the Cosmere releases you've skipped out on. The Lord of the Rings, The Wheel of Time, A Song of Ice and Fire. Fans of fantasy may love the occasional standalone novel here and there, but this is a genre known for its sweeping epics that span multiple books for a truly grand adventure. An author must write an entire series of epic novels to cement themselves into the annals of history, into the hearts of readers across the world. Given his proclivity for writing, some might say it was inevitable that Brandon Sanderson would try his own hand at an epic saga. So how did it all turn out? Pretty good. Mostly. But let's tackle the Stormlight Archive one book at a time, starting with The Way of Kings. The Stormlight Archive takes place on the rocky world of Roshar, and the gimmick here is that it is a world beset by violent, destructive storms that also provide stormlight, the magical substance used to enhance warriors and fuel much of the technology on the world. In addition, the planet is also littered with entities known as Spren, fairy-like creatures that are influenced by life on Roshar, and even capable of forging bonds to provide additional magical power. Roshar is a world at war. When the series begins, humans are locked in conflict with the humanoid beings known as the Singers, or as the Parshmen when they are enslaved by humans. Their main enemy is the Aleti, a nation of nomadic warriors who seek to avenge the death of their great king, Gavilar Kholin. However, conquest is difficult when there is so much tension within the kingdom. Alethkar is ruled by warlords known as the Bright Lords, who in turn segregate their people between Bright Eyes and Dark Eyes. When the story begins, we follow the tale of one such dark-eyed man, Kaladin, who is being sent to the war front to help man the bridges for his slave owner and Bright Lord. A Spren quickly takes note of him, and their bond is the main impetus for the story that will change not just the world of Roshar, but also come to define Brandon Sanderson's entire career. That was my longest introduction yet to a book, and I haven't even hinted at Shallan, Adolin, Navani, and the many other important characters that make up the story of The Way of Kings. The best part of the Stormlight Archives is that this is a really well-developed epic, featuring the most realized world in all of the works set within the Cosmere. For those who come to the fantasy genre looking to expand their imagination, well, the Stormlight Archive literally brings imagination to life with the Spren and their influence upon Roshar. When it comes to ranking the best books within the Cosmere, most people tend to pick either The Way of Kings or its direct sequel, Words of Radiance, as the best books that Sanderson has written. My favorite isn't either of them, but they both rank very highly on my ranking list regardless. These are truly excellent books, some of the best fantasy a person can ever read. Assuming you can make it past the first 100 pages. Unlike later books in the Stormlight Archives, there isn't actually that much fluff in The Way of Kings, and the pacing for most of the book is great. However, just like one of the most beloved books of science fiction, Dune, The Way of Kings throws you into the thick of things and doesn't do much to hold your hand. And it really takes some time to start putting the pieces together, because there is not one, not two, but 3 different prologues you have to read through before the main plot even begins. 2 of them should have been cut or moved later into the story. The opening scene with Kalak is important to the lore, but it is deeply confusing as an introduction. I've met multiple who admitted they put the book down because they read it at a bookstore and didn't understand what the hell was going on. As for the chapter with Ken, it does help set the overall tone of the Stormlight Archive, but the wedding assassination chapter with Szeth does it better. In fact, I think meeting Kaladin as a depressed slave first, with no context, would have been a better introduction. So that's just one of many examples where Sanderson would have benefited from tighter editing. But that's really it for my major criticisms. I do have quibbles and concerns about certain characters, looking at you, Yasna, but the overall experience of reading The Way of Kings for the first time is magical. This is especially true when it comes to the climax, which is the single best ending featured in any book Sanderson has written within the Cosmere. When Dalinar decides to trade his blade to save Kaladin and the other bridge crews, I practically leapt to my feet with joy and excitement, and from that point on, I knew I was committed to reading the rest of the Stormlight Archive. A shame I didn't quite enjoy the destination, but at least the journey had a truly amazing start. When Brandon Sanderson pitched Mistborn, he explained was that it would be a series with multiple eras. Most fantasy stories tend to stick to one isolated period of the world's history, but Sanderson wanted to cover the development of a planet and its people across hundreds and hundreds of years. The original pitch was that Mistborn would consist of 3 eras, consisting of a medieval-style era, a modern era, and a space age era. But something unexpected occurred with Sanderson's career. Mistborn Era 1 ultimately succeeded, cementing Sanderson's place within the writing world, but it also drew the attention of Harriet McDougal, the wife of Robert Jordan. Robert Jordan was the author behind The Wheel of Time, a beloved series of fantasy books that he was unable to complete due to passing away in 2007. His widow, Harriet, ultimately asked Sanderson to complete her late husband's work, resulting in Sanderson writing 3 books within The Wheel of Time. This puts Sanderson in an awkward place. Sanderson was committed to seeing the end of Robert Jordan's work, but doing so meant he would have to put some of his own plans on hold. He didn't want to fully commit to writing the modern Mistborn series or continuing the Stormlight Archive while he was neck deep in finishing The Wheel of Time. However, he didn't want fans of his work to go too long without reading a book set within the Cosmere. What was his solution? Sanderson took what was originally going to be a short story and turned it into a novel that would kickstart what is now known as Mistborn Era 2. About 300 years following the end of the Hero of Ages, Scadrial finds itself rapidly developing thanks to the guiding hand of its god Harmony. However, even in eras of peace, there are those with ill intent, and in this now steampunk world we find ourselves, following the stories of former lawman turned nobleman Wax and his trusty partner Wayne. This is a breezy novel. It's one of the shortest that Sanderson has ever written, and the first of Mistborn Era 2, also called the Wax and Wayne series, doesn't have a lot of depth. But it is a ton of fun, and the most important thing it does is show that Brandon Sanderson is very capable of writing good fantasy stories that don't take place in a traditional medieval style setting. I do like one of these main characters a lot more than the other. Waxilium Ladrian is a fantastic protagonist, and seeing him go from your traditional cowboy lawman to adjusting to life in the big city is a great way to begin this series. I'll spoil it right now, but the relationship that grows between Wax and his arranged wife, Steris Harms, is my favorite romance across the entire Cosmere. Wayne is very hit or miss for me. He is the comedic sidekick for this series, the bad man and outlaw who is trying to be good and find his place in civil society. There are some great moments with him, but because he is the funny guy, there are many instances of him doing something very terrible and it getting passed off as a joke. The lighter tone of the Wax and Wayne books, especially the Alloy of Law, gives him somewhat of a free pass, but ultimately, Wayne is a character that is best taken in small doses. There is a third leading character, one who continues to grow in importance with each book in Mistborn Era 2, and that is Marcy Colmes. She starts off as someone who idolizes Wax, but grows to become more and more of her own person with every book in the Wax and Wayne series. Going from the naive superfan to a dedicated lawmaker in her own right was a fine character arc for her, though some of her criminal justice theories and proposed reforms did make me roll my eyes on more than one occasion. The Wax and Wayne feature some of Sanderson's better villains, and that includes the main antagonist of the Alloy of Law, Miles Daggeter. Miles seems pretty invincible when he is fought, and his status as a former lawmaker makes it clear that one of the overall themes of Mistborn Era 2 will be the true nature of the law. He also plants the seeds for the greater mysteries and plot lines that run throughout Mistborn Era 2, the encroaching influence of Trell. For a series that Sanderson never originally planned to write, one that probably wouldn't exist if he didn't have to work on the Wheel of Time, The Alloy of Law isn't just great. This book is absolutely excellent. Unlike Mistborn Era 1, I immediately fell in love with nearly everything that was going on in Mistborn Era 2. Unlike Mistborn Era 1, I also think that the books got progressively worse instead of better, but considering that the Wax and Wayne series started off on such a high note, I suppose that was inevitable, but we'll get to that later in the video. There aren't many people in life who can say that they've written a sequel on the level of The Empire Strikes Back. Brandon Sanderson can. Words of Radiance is the Stormlight Archive in its best, most perfect form. Everything you want from a sequel is featured in this book and more. Characters grow in depth while introducing new characters that will become mainstays in the Stormlight Archive. Questions are answered while asking new questions that continue to expand the world. As for the Cosmere itself, the connections to other books really starts to pay dividends, making the book even more exciting as the scope of Sanderson's universe expands. And the finale? The arrival of the Everstorm? The duel between Kaladin and Szeth? I mean it when I say that Words of Radiance is one of the best sequels of all time. What makes Words of Radiance so special? One underrated aspect is the fact that among all of the books of Brandon Sanderson, this feels like the book where characters have their morals and beliefs tested the most. I genuinely couldn't guess at how some characters are going to react in certain instances, and frankly, didn't even know what the right decisions was in some situations. That is the secret behind good drama, and Words of Radiance is full of some of the best drama Sanderson has ever come up with. There are just too many memorable scenes to even try and list them all here. The many duels of Adolin, Kaladin leaping into the arena, the return of the Knights Radiant, Moash's betrayal, the final battle, the death of Sadeas. So much happens in this book, and yet it all moves incredibly quickly despite being about 400,000 words in length. Once again, my commentary is going to be short because I can't think of a single complaint to level against Words of Radiance. This is the best book in the Stormlight Archive, and the best sequel Sanderson has ever written. It would be my favorite book in the Cosmere too, but one of the secret project titles actually managed to be even better than Words of Radiance. However, second best is still great, and that's why I am more than happy to give Words of Radiance a perfect rating. Following the success of The Alloy of Law, Sanderson decided that Mistborn Era 2 would consist of 4 total books set within the era. But if you thought that backstory for The Alloy of Law was complicated, then wait until you hear the story of how Shadows of Self got made. Just as The Alloy of Law was a way for Sanderson to clear his palette while working on The Wheel of Time and the Stormlight Archive, Shadows of Self was a side project that Sanderson worked on while he wrote the final book in The Wheel of Time, A Memory of Light. Sanderson wrote about a third of Shadows of Self before he devoted his full attention to A Memory of Light, which ended up being a problem when he came back to Shadows of Self. Much like any project in life, getting back into a project that was only partially finished leads to some tension and unease. What did Sanderson do to resolve this? Sanderson wrote the third book in Mistborn Era 2, The Bands of Mourning, then went back to finish up Shadows of Self. As much as I love Mistborn Era 2, liking it even more than Mistborn Era 1, one of my biggest criticisms of tetralogy is that it feels pretty disjointed. In television, the two common formats when designing series is serialized and procedural. A serialized show is one that features episodes that the viewer needs to watch in order with a heavy emphasis on plot, while a procedural show features self-contained episodes with only a loose overall narrative and character development. You can watch Seinfeld, Star Trek, G.I. Joe, or Parks and Recreation in any order you want and still understand what's going on, even if you miss out on certain character development details. But you really need to watch shows like Game of Thrones or Better Call Saul in order to fully appreciate the story being told. Mistborn Era 2 is a weird one because it does feel like a procedural series rather than a serialized one. This is the only sub-series in the Cosmere I can say that about, and I'm not sure if it's because of the lighter tone or because of the weird way in which it was developed. What I do know is that unlike Mistborn Era 1, where each book directly sets up and leads into the next, the actual plots and conspiracies that took place in Mistborn Era 2 aren't really connected to one another. Of the books in Mistborn Era 2, Shadows of Self is the least important. As Wax and Steris plan their wedding, Wayne and Marasi convince Wax to help them track down a troubling criminal. However, doing so causes them to uncover a conspiracy that is behind the recent instability in society, one that involves the shape-shifting Khandra and, in the ultimate reveal of the book, Wax's former lover. Once again, Wax is the best part of the Wax and Wayne series, but I did roll my eyes at how his story ends in this book. making Wax an agent for Harmony in the Alloy of Law, only to turn around and write a story that causes him to turn his back on Harmony in Shadows of Self, is pretty disappointing. It also continues Sanderson's bad habit of realizing that he can't maintain the drama if Wax is getting so much divine help. But that's not my biggest grievance with the book. Shadows of Self is ultimately a commentary on how the government responds to rising societal tensions and dissatisfaction, and ultimately, the dangers of using the police to suppress the will of the people. It does an okay job of it, and isn't anywhere near as heavy-handed or overbearing as other works of fiction. But I also find the commentary to be a little tedious given how the book concludes. Mistborn Era 2 does take place in a world with many magical elements, including shapeshifters who have, as it turned out, infiltrated the highest rungs of society. For the sake of the commentary in the novel, and even to make a better plot, it would have been better if it turned out that there were no Khandra impersonating everyone, that all of the tension and paranoia came simply because humans will be humans. Even so, this is still a breezy read and just as fun to go through as the Alloy of Law. Shadows of Self shows that Sanderson does have it in him to write a political thriller one day, though he does need to be more thoughtful about what he's trying to say when writing such a book. I just wish it did feel more important to the series, because I genuinely feel like I wouldn't have missed out on much had I read the Alloy of Law and skipped directly to the Bands of Mourning. I would have loved to have seen Sanderson's original overarching plans for Mistborn Era 2, because the overall feeling of disjointedness gets even worse in the Bands of Mourning. Of the 4 books in the series, this one is the weakest, though that's the result of many smaller issues rather than one major weakness. To start, the weird thing about Mistborn Era 2 is that each book within the series is actually a different genre than the last. The Alloy of Law is a typical detective story. Shadows of Self is more of a political thriller, while The Bands of Mourning is an adventure novel with a real Indiana Jones or Tomb Raider flair. This is Pulp Fiction, with the train fight sequence, the party in New Seren, the graveyard fight, the Sovereign's Temple, and the airship fight, all moments that feel taken out of the biggest adventure stories that have come out in the last 50 years. In general, this isn't a bad thing. I think The Bands of Mourning is the worst book in Mistborn Era 2, but it is still an incredibly fun read full of great and exciting moments. But the tonal and genre mismatch from novel to novel really feels out of place with The Bands of Mourning, something that shows that Sanderson might not have planned as much when developing this subseries as he did for substories like Mistborn Era 1 or the Stormlight Archive. This is especially true for the antagonists of this book. The Alloy of Law sets up Wax's uncle as the main antagonist for the series, and he ends up being a wash. He barely features in Shadows of Self, and despite being the overarching antagonist for the series, he doesn't even show up much in this book. He gets a good fight in with Wax, but Mr. Suit ultimately winds up being a very forgettable mustache-twirling villain, despite the amount of time spent building him up. That's partially because this book tries to pull the twist that Wax's sister, Telsin, was the real mastermind manipulating everything from the shadows. As first presented as a hostage of the evil uncle, she tries to play the part of the loving sister, manipulating Wax into helping her obtain the Bands of Mourning. I used the word tries because I don't think the twist works that well in the Bands of Mourning or in Mistborn Era 2 at large. This is partially due to how things play out in the Lost Metal, but also because I think that Telsin was introduced way too late into the series. Had she been a major character from the start, the twist that she was the true mastermind would have been more significant. but she is an off-putting character, not just from the first moment you meet her in the present, but even in the flashback she comes off as twisted and strange. While the Bands of Mourning has the most issues out of any of the books in the series, much of it is redeemed because I absolutely adore how Wax and Steris develop their relationship in this book. I said before that they have the best romance in the entire Cosmere, and the Bands of Mourning is what really shows it off. The two play off each other so well, I really wish this had been the Wax and Steris series instead of the adventures of Wax and Wayne. But before we can move on, I should bring up the final reveal. Remember how I said that Mistborn the Final Empire got retconned twice? The first retcon was that the Lord Ruler wasn't the evil Dark Lord that Sanderson says he was when he pitched the book, but was actually an anti-hero trying to contain the malignancy known as Ruin. What was the other major retcon, the decision Sanderson went back on? Kelsier has returned as the Sovereign. That's a twist I have real mixed feelings on. I love Kelsier as a character, and I do think that he makes not just the Mistborn series, but the Cosmere as a whole better. When he pops up, it really is the Kelsier show, and whenever he leaves, I do find myself wondering when I get to see him again. Even so, it does hurt his big sacrifice and the twist of the Final Empire, and is part of the reason why I rank that book so low. Apart from this major twist, the conclusion of the Bands of Mourning is weird because it does feel like, with a couple more chapters, Mistborn Era 2 could have ended here. It kind of did, because despite books 2 and 3 coming out relatively close to one another, the true ending to Mistborn Era 2 wouldn't come out for another 6 years. Fans of Sanderson wouldn't be lacking for content to read, however, as you can tell if you look at the remaining length of this video. But we've reached the halfway point, so congratulations. Take a break. Go for a walk and get some fresh air, or grab something to eat before you continue. If I were a bigger channel, this is where I would put my sponsored ad. But fortunately for both of us, we don't have to worry about silly things like that. There might be something else around the corner, but hey, you wouldn't be here unless you loved stories, right? The Cosmere isn't just made up of novels. No, across the course of his career, Sanderson has also published and released a variety of short stories and novellas, or stories that are all less than 60,000 words. The good news is that if you are a Cosmere completionist, all but one of the short stories can be found in Arcanum Unbounded, making it a good place to resume our review of the Cosmere universe. The bad news is that I don't think many of them are particularly good, but I'm not going to blame Sanderson entirely for this one. While I can love a good short story, they aren't something I go out of my way to read, and I typically prefer short stories that test the extreme of humanity and their psyche. You're not going to find something on the level of To Build a Fire, The Yellow Wallpaper, or The Lottery among these works. So what will you find? Arcanum Unbounded includes The Hope of Elantris. These are a couple of chapters that serve as an extended epilogue to Elantris. You find out what the characters have been up to since the ending of that book, and if you've bought a newer version of the novel, then odds are you've already read this. It's a cute little addition, though if Sanderson does intend to write Elantris sequels one day, it would have been better to include more concrete teases in this story. The Emperor's Soul. This is one of Sanderson's most famous stories, not just in this collection, but in the Cosmere as a whole, because it actually won a Novella Hugo Award. Though it technically takes place on the same world as Elantris, The Emperor's Soul is set within a more Asian-like setting and has little to do with Elantris. In this story, the Emperor has been left brain dead after a failed assassination attempt. A forger is brought in to try and recreate his soul, all while those around her try to manipulate her into reshaping the Emperor's mind according to the politics of the court. So does it live up to the hype? I do think The Emperor's Soul is the best short story featured in the collection, but that isn't saying much since I don't think any of the other stories are that good. This is a story that suffers from Sanderson trying to do too many things in too short a time or story length. It tries to study the nature of the Emperor just through his writings and the memories of others, but the Emperor isn't all that interesting as a person. The main character, Shai, is a solid protagonist, but you only get some surface-level impressions of her since she spends the entire story trapped in one place, with much of her attention focused on other people. Honestly, I think I walked away with a better understanding of who Shai and why I should care about her because of her appearance in The Lost Metal, and she was a side character in that book. Even so, it is novella that has gained more relevance within the Cosmere as time has gone on. If you were to go out of your way to read only one of the stories featured in Arcanum Unbounded, I would pick this one or Secret History. The 11th Metal. This short story was included as part of one of the earliest attempts at a Cosmere TTRPG, the Mistborn adventure game. Released around the same time as The Alloy of Law, it details the training of Kelsier from his master, Gemmel, and how the two were manipulated by Ruin during the course of Mistborn Era 1. I'm not a huge fan of writing prequel or origin stories for dead characters, Solo being a prime example. But this story is pretty funny in retrospect because it is the first tease that Kelsier is coming back. If you're a Kelsier superfan, it gives you a pretty good look into his character, but is a story you don't really need to read if you aren't. Allomancer Jack and the Pits of Eltanya. Allomancer Jack is a pulp hero who gets featured in the supplemental materials for Mistborn Era 2. Like the 11th Metal, this story was actually created for one of the expansions of the Mistborn adventure game, and expands upon a character who is often mentioned, but is never really featured in Mistborn Era 2. This is a fun little adventure story that would have fit in well with the works of Edgar Rice Burroughs. Once again, it doesn't really have anything to do with the world and era it's set in, so read it or skip it, depending on your tastes regarding Mistborn Era 2. Mistborn: Secret History. When it comes to Cosmere connections and understanding the overall plot, Mistborn's Secret History is the most important. It's unfortunate that I don't think it's particularly great in terms of quality, but that is in part because I don't love Mistborn Era 1 as much as the average Sanderson Cosmere fan. Mistborn Secret History serves as an expansion to Mistborn Era 1. It follows Kelsier and his quest to try and return to life following his death at the hands of the Lord Ruler. This journey does a lot to explain some of the unanswered mysteries throughout the Mistborn saga, and for the first time in the series, goes deep into who the original shard holders were and what it means to become a shard vessel. Unfortunately, the one big question of how Kelsier returned to life isn't fully explained here, but the foundation for his revival is established with the events of this novella. As much as I love Kelsier, I don't love this story because of its disjointed nature and how most of it comes off as a sort of authorial commentary rather than an actual story. Kelsier effectively being a ghost the whole story also limits his agency, and there's not really much drama or suspense since anyone reading this story would already know how Mistborn Era 1 ends and that Kelsier will escape death. Even so, one of the best scenes is when Kelsier gets to speak to Vin and Elend, a good send-off to them and to Mistborn Era 1 as a whole. Again, not the best story in the collection in terms of quality, but absolutely worth reading if you want to understand the Cosmere better as a whole. White Sand. White Sand is Sanderson's graphic novel, and it follows the adventures of Kenton, a sandmaster with the ability to use investiture and water to manipulate the sand of Taldane. Before it became a graphic novel, it was one of the very first books that Sanderson planned to write, though he ultimately shelved the project until a company approached him to make a comic from one of his unfinished works. The prologue and first chapter of the White Sand prose version is included in Arcanum Unbounded, along with a dozen pages from the comic. With the White Sand graphic novel concluded, I'll share deeper thoughts about it in its own section later in this video. For Cosmere superfans, I would just skip this part of Arcanum Unbounded and recommend you either go into the full graphic novel or wait for Brandon Sanderson to finish the prose version that he has returned to writing. Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell. George R. R. Martin has been busy doing anything and everything but working on A Song of Ice and Fire over the years. One of his usual distractions is releasing short story anthologies from various writers in the greater literary community, with one such collection being focused on dangerous women. Sanderson accepted, and from this invitation came Shadows for Silence in the Forests of Hell. So what is this about? Silence Montaigne manages a waystop innkeeper for weary travelers looking for a safe place to rest on Threnody, a world haunted by destructive spirits known as shades. However, she is also secretly a bounty hunter who uses her waystop to get to know wanted criminals, but does so carefully, since those who break the simple rules of Threnody are often attacked by the shades that haunt the world. So here's what is pretty disappointing about this short story. The premise and how the story came to be are way more interesting than the story itself. The entire story is only about 17,000 words long, and Sanderson really does suffer when he comes to writing stories with such tight constraints. Silence is a different woman than the usual female characters that Sanderson writes, but just because she's different doesn't mean she's interesting. It's hard to get attached to any of the other characters because of their short time in the story. Sanderson has talked about how he isn't good at writing grimdark, and that's readily apparent when you read this short story. This isn't a short story I think you have to go out of your way to read, but it does serve as the introduction to Threnody, a world that doesn't matter much in the early Cosmere, but has grown more and more in importance as time has gone on. Whether that's enough to get you to care is going to depend on your interest levels in the Cosmere. If you do decide to read it, I don't think you'll hate the story. But if you're like me, you won't be remembering much from this story either. That I don't really care if I ever see any of these characters again is the biggest indictment against it, and a big problem with Arcanum Unbounded as a whole. Sixth of the Dusk. Do not read this story. Not because it's bad, because among the collection, it's actually among the best. No, the problem is that Sixth of the Dusk has now been revised and expanded upon, serving as the first quarter of the novel Isles of the Emberdark. There is no reason to read Sixth of the Dusk because Isles of the Emberdark exists. That said, things haven't been changed so much that if you have already read Sixth of the Dusk, you're pretty much fine just skipping the first section of Isles of the Emberdark without missing anything important. Edgedancer. So far, Brandon Sanderson has written 2 novellas set on Roshar, the setting of the Stormlight Archive. Somehow he managed to write these novellas about the 2 characters I hate the most in this series. Edgedancer is the first novella and stars the child, known as Lift. Lift is a character you're going to love or hate, depending on how you answer 2 questions. The first question is what you think of child characters in stories, and the second is what do you think of Sanderson's sense of humor. I generally don't like most stories that feature children as protagonists, and I think Sanderson's sense of humor is hit or miss, so even going into this novella I wasn't excited for a whole story about her. But man, almost nothing even happens in this story. Most of the novella is just Lift wasting her time, though her adventures inadvertently help her progress her radiant oaths. On the flip side, Nail gets expanded upon in this story, but the transformation he undergoes in this story didn't really require Lift. In fact, Nail's character is much better served and focused on in Wind and Truth, making his inclusion here even more pointless beyond what happens at the end of Edgedancer. I would readily dismiss this novella as one for only true Sanderson diehard fans, but if Sanderson is sticking to his planned outline for the Stormlight Archives, Book 6 will feature Lift as the flashback viewpoint character. How will the story of Edgedancer impact it? Will Edgedancer itself be included in Stormlight 6? Come back in 5 to 10 years to see how well this part of the video aged. bringing us to the end of Arcanum Unbounded. Apart from Edge Dancer, there isn't really any stories that I hated, but there weren't any stories that I loved either. It exists for people who can't get enough of the works of Brandon Sanderson, but apart from Mistborn's Secret History, I don't think any of the stories included are must-reads. The fact that Sanderson has largely moved on from short stories set within the Cosmere would indicate to me that he doesn't feel that strongly about them either, and given what happened with Isles of the Emberdark, well, don't be surprised if that isn't the only short story that gets expanded upon in the future. The middle point in any saga can be a challenging one. You've already laid most of the groundwork and done most of the introductions in the first chapter, but you can't wrap up the major storylines or kill off many of the significant characters until you're ready to conclude the series. Are there great middle points in a series? Certainly, but for every The Empire Strikes Back, you also wind up with an attack of the clones, and for every The Two Towers, you get the desolation of Smaug. Oathbringer represents the best and the worst of being the middle entry in a series. This is a book with some incredible highs, and also where some of the major problems with the Stormlight Archive start popping up. Some characters see some great development, while some characters don't really change much at all in the story. There's also starting to be just too many characters, and the pacing really takes a hit compared to the previous two books at the word count approaches 500,000. This book could have been worse though. A big development change that helped this book and Wind and Truth is that instead of Szeth being the focus of the flashbacks, Dalinar would wind up becoming the real main character of this novel. At long last, we finally get to fully understand the story of the Blackthorn, and ultimately, by the end of Oathbringer, Dalinar cemented his place as my single favorite character that Sanderson has ever developed in the Cosmere. But whereas Dalinar is the clear highlight of the novel, I don't really have any strong feelings towards any of the other characters and the development they go through. Kaladin's greatest enemy up to this point has been Amaram, but how their mutual storyline concludes isn't particularly satisfying. Shallan is a messy character that has gotten messier with each book, while the extended Kholin clan, consisting of Yasna, Adolin, and Renarin, all see some minor developments, but nothing as memorable as what happened in the previous two novels. I think part of my disappointment with this book is the weird way that the battles in the book are depicted. Much of the book is spent dealing with the battle over Kholinar, which the Coppermind describes as a siege. I guess that is the most accurate word to describe it, but sieges in fiction are exciting because you're waiting for the moment when the walls come down. How will our heroes survive when the enemy starts swarming into the city? The game of cat and mouse that... Oathgate. They'll just escape through the Oathgate. The cool, epic battle you were looking forward to as the Voidbringers finally seize control of the city? Yeah, you're not going to experience the best part of the battle because our main heroes all get whisked away to safety. Once again, I have to bring up one of my major problems with Sanderson, and that's his bad habit of introducing magical powers that prove too useful so they get nerfed or removed from the story. Oathgates ended up being way too useful in Oathbringer, so I guessed that within the next book or two they'd be taken out of the picture. Sure enough, they totally are, which leaves me unsatisfied because introducing something cool only to quickly take it away leaves me disappointed in the writing. Speaking of which, I do think Oathbringer features the weakest of the climaxes of all of the books within the Stormlight Archive. Frankly, it's one of the weakest climaxes in the entire Cosmere. Sanderson is an author that can handle action well, and he's done big battles before to great success in other books within the Cosmere. The Battle of Thaylen Field is not one of them. I already mentioned Kaladin, so let me say again that his duel with Amaram is pretty unsatisfying. It felt like Sanderson trying to write his version of a Dark Souls-style duel, but I don't think it came across well. I'm also pretty mixed on how this battle ultimately boiled down to Dalinar summoning Honor's Perpendicularity. On the one hand, it is one of the best moments in the Stormlight Archives, and a fantastic resolution to Dalinar's character arc that had been depicted across the series. On the other hand, and this is a criticism of the entire Stormlight Archives, as it is of Oathbringer, Dalinar's character arc basically climaxes in this novel. He doesn't feature much at all in Words of Radiance, and any developments that happen in Wind and Truth barely change the man and are dragged out across the book's long length. Hindsight is 20/20, but if the plan was to always kill Dalinar, I frankly would have liked it and Oathbringer more if it happened at the end of this book, especially because I think Nergawl, or the Thrill, is one of the worst concepts that Sanderson has come up with in the entire Cosmere. As someone who has studied soldiers, including the effects of adrenaline, combat highs, and what compels warriors to fight and kill, that is one of the most fascinating aspects of human psychology to me. So to find out that this intriguing part of the soul is actually supernaturally influenced by an outside entity in the Stormlight Archives, the Thrill is the midi-chlorians of the Stormlight Archives, and if that isn't an indictment of this book, I don't know what is. But hey, at least Oathbringer isn't anywhere near as bad as Rhythm of War. Following the release of Arcanum Unbounded, Brandon Sanderson has released only one additional novella. That would be Dawnshard, and it features some of the things I hate the most out of the entire Cosmere. Risen, Lopen, and the Sleepless. Here's the premise. Following the events of Oathbringer, Roshar finds itself stuck in a full-scale war between Dalinar and the forces of Urithiru against Odium and his Singer forces. There are those who are unwitting participants in the conflict, including Risen and the crew of the Wandersail. If you forgot who Risen was, she was one of the side characters from earlier novels who, after suffering the dumbest accident in the Cosmere, has lost the use of her legs. Even so, the wheelchair-bound merchant captain is willing to brave into the unknown, and so she is tasked to uncover the secrets of Amia, in hopes of serving Navani and to help cure her pet, the knights Radiant, Huio, and Lopen accompanying her as protection. The Stormlight Archives as a whole is a lengthy commentary on mental health, with Dawnshard being a companion piece by focusing on what is a somewhat interconnected issue: people who suffer from disabilities. Risen is a cripple who is forced to use a wheelchair to get around. Lopen lived much of his life with one arm, until it was restored upon becoming a Knights Radiant. And I've even seen some fans suggest that the Sleepless are a metaphor for neurodivergent individuals. I wonder if Sanderson regrets giving Lopen his arm back, if he might have even upset some fans by doing so, because the big twist in this story is that Risen becomes a vessel for one of the 4 Dawnshards. Despite being made one of the most powerful beings in the universe, the Dawnshard doesn't restore her ability to walk, which is a frustrating conclusion to what was already one of the dumber subplots in the Cosmere. It also reinforces one of the philosophies that I think me and Brandon Sanderson just fundamentally disagree on. I will go more into this when I one day make my video about why The Dog and the Dragon is a terrible story. But Sanderson seems to believe that, to some extent, you have to just accept that some bad things in life are the way they are and move on. Maybe even see them not so much as problems and disabilities, but as simply another approach to life. Screw that. To hell with that. Leave a comment below if you recognize what I'm quoting. But that's an argument only a loser would make. A victor should speak of how the world should be, rather than how the world currently operates. Anything less than living your life doing everything in your power to change the world more into your liking means living a wasted and unfulfilled life, which means rejecting, overcoming, and resolving anything holding you back. In a world full of fantasy powers, including meeting those with the ability to even regrow missing body parts, accepting to remain disabled is spitting in the face of those who would give anything to walk again, and is a reason why some people I know who are similarly paralyzed like Risen despise her as a character. Lopen is Lopen. I don't like Lopen because I don't really like his sense of humor. Lopen and Wayne share a lot of similar characteristics, including the fact that they get to be assholes whose bad behavior often gets excused because they're the comedic side character. He's an annoying pest, but he isn't anywhere near as bad as the Sleepless. I have yet to read a single book with the Sleepless where they come out in a good light. They're Sanderson's take on a hive mind being, but despite being a shared intelligence, nearly every Sleepless character has wound up being a dangerous sociopath that justifies all manner of cruelty and violence in the name of self-preservation. Besides the fact that they're literal bug people, I don't buy into the idea of collective conscious hive mind capable of true thought on par with human intelligence, and the Cosmere has done nothing to sell me on the idea. The only thing that keeps Dawnshard from being the worst book in the Cosmere is the fact that it does tell a lot about one of the important powers in the universe, the aforementioned Dawnshards. Furthermore, I do like the structure of the story, of adventurers trying to uncover island secrets. Even members of the crew work against their captain, but the story is wasted by its characters and themes. Besides, we already got an Indiana Jones-like adventure in the Bands of Mourning, and it does it a whole pulp adventure a whole lot better than Dawnshard does. This would be the single worst story in the Cosmere. But now we finally have to talk about the actual biggest loser. Rhythm of War. Welp, here it is. The single worst book in the Cosmere. I don't even have a good joke or witty comment to set up this part of the video. Rhythm of War is garbage, so settle in. I'm not going to go over every reason why this book is terrible, but I will hit the issues that pissed me off the most. Do you remember what I said back in the Oathbringer section, how Sanderson has a bad habit of making characters too powerful, so he decides to nerf or disable them? Well, a significant chunk of the action that takes place in the book's main location, the Tower of Urithiru, involves having the powers of the main characters repressed. Sure, there's something fun about having a chapter or two where the main character can't use their abilities, but this book is 50,000 words short of 500,000 words. Can you guess how I feel about the terrible pacing? Now, which of the main characters do we want to tackle first? How about the flashback characters? Rhythm of War tells the backstory of the two Singer sisters, Venli and Eshonai. Who's Eshonai? She was the leader of the Singer forces who died back at the end of Words of Radiance. You would think that Sanderson would have learned his lesson from Solo that maybe you shouldn't dedicate a significant chunk of your story to telling the background of a character that's already dead. And maybe with a different character it would have worked better. But though Venli is very much still alive, she really isn't that interesting of a character. Not to me, and it's because of the fact that I really don't care about the Singers. With each passing Stormlight Archive book, Sanderson does try to make you more and more sympathetic for the true natives of Roshar. Whether he succeeds or not in this endeavor depends on your personal preferences, but for me, I don't care about bugmen. So how do the other characters fare? Well, Kaladin not only sucks, he's offensively bad in this book. Throughout much of the Stormlight Archive, Kaladin was one of my favorite characters, especially as he struggled with what many come to realize is clinical depression. This is the one book where I think Sanderson does a poor job of exhibiting how people with depression behave, and does an even worse job when it comes to depicting how people with depression should get treated. Ready for me to drop what will be my most controversial Cosmere take yet? I won't go into detail here, but The Dog and the Dragon is a bad story. I hate it so much I will release a video explaining in detail why it is not the story you want to tell someone who suffers from depression. I thought about doing it here, but did you see how long the video is already? Dalinar barely features in this story, which is somewhat disappointing in retrospect since he's going to die in the next Stormlight Archive novel. Szeth doesn't get a ton of development, but I will admit the ending with him and his attempted assassination of Taravangian, leading to the death of Odium's host race, was a shocking development that made the setup for Wind and Truth significantly more exciting. Shallan and Adolin do a lot to redeem this book. Even though she isn't the true main character, with most of her flashbacks already told in another book, Shallan finally starting to reunite her fragmented personalities was a great development for her. Furthermore, Adolin really starts to come into his own as a character, and seeing the growing romance between Adolin and Shallan made their chapters some of my favorite in the entire Stormlight archive. But there's a reason why this is my most hated book in the entire Cosmere, and that reason is named Navani : Here's what really sucks. Navani was one of my favorite characters going into Rhythm of War. Dalinar is a better character because of how she plays off of him, and seeing her rise from a trusted friend and companion to his wife and second in command made her character arc one of the best in the series. But man, I sure do regret ever wanting to have her as a major viewpoint character. The problem with Navani is that she becomes the mouthpiece for Sanderson's love of world building and scientific curiosities. Of all the books set within the Cosmere, Rhythm of War is absolutely the most self-indulgent in this regard. Much of the plot consists of Navani and the singer Rabaniel studying the secrets of the Tower and ultimately discovering the secrets of Anti-Void Light. Once again, Sanderson made a seemingly invincible enemy in the Fused, and so he had to devote a chunk of his story to devising a means to make them actually defeatable. Unlike the other times when he has to weaken something that is too powerful in his universe, this one doesn't bother me that much. Finding out how to take down that which seems impossible to defeat should have been fun. Let me repeat that. It should have been fun, but it isn't. Because Sanderson makes it as boring as possible, though that is in large part due to the medium in which he is trying to tell his story. In concept, the idea that performing certain rhythms causes magical power on Roshar to behave a certain way is actually pretty cool. But this isn't a movie or a TV show we're discussing, is it? This is a book, which means the only thing I'm hearing when I'm reading all of this are the sounds I imagine in my own head. And as someone who likes music but isn't particularly well versed in the art of music and sound, it all lands terribly flat for me. There is also something to be said for devoting so much time and storytelling to the scientific study of something that doesn't exist in our reality. I am someone who loves studying new things and learning. I have gone down many a Wikipedia rabbit hole, or spent many an hour on YouTube watching how things get made, are developed, or discovered. However, that time is spent to learn about things that actually exist in my world. Sure, I'll take an hour to learn about how horseshoes are made, or the history of the development of the light bulb, but I would never waste that kind of time learning about the dietary habits of griffins, or study the intricate rules of advanced Quidditch. If you are that kind of person, if that's what gets you into fiction, then great. I'm glad you found what makes you happy. Rhythm of War is the book that forgets that not every fan is there because they want a world-building buffet. You will absolutely have your fill with this book, considering it's nearly 500,000 words long. But most of it is just poor-tasting slop. Sure, there is the occasional good piece of meat here and there, but there's so many empty calories you've got to get through first. If Oathbringer suffered from twiddling its thumbs, then Rhythm of War is absolutely guilty of spinning its wheels, with much of the book feeling like it's just there to set up Wind and Truth. So to wrap up my thoughts, this isn't the worst book I've ever read. I don't think it even cracks my bottom 50. But for someone as consistent as Brandon Sanderson, Rhythm of War is disappointing because it was his first real miss to me. If I were to compare it to the MCU, this was his Eternals. Works that aren't pure garbage, but lackluster when compared to everything else within their universes. Everyone has to have a bad day at the office eventually. A shame Sanderson's first failure just had to be a part of the Stormlight archive. The Lost Metal is always going to hold a special place in my heart because it is the first book in the Cosmere that I read at launch. From what I understand, this was one of Sanderson's more controversial releases within the larger Cosmere fan community, but whether it's because of when it came out or because it's the finale of Mistborn Era 2, I do think this is one of the best novels set within the Cosmere. It is, like every book set within Era 2, a strange one. My biggest complaint about it is that where something like Shadows of Self felt inconsequential and a book you can easily skip, The Lost Metal is too jam-packed and fast-paced. If anything, The Lost Metal feels like another season was planned for a TV show, but in order to wrap things up more quickly, the showrunners were told they'd have to finish their series in one extra long finale. Maybe it's because of how much I loved Mistborn Era 2, but I do wish The Lost Metal could have been split into a couple books, because there are things that suffer in this book because of how much has to get wrapped up in this novel. I wasn't sold on Telsin as a character in the Bands of Mourning, and that is especially true because of her role in The Lost Metal. Just as Mr. Suit barely mattered as a character, Telsin too doesn't really end up being much a factor when it comes to the greater scheme of this story and Mistborn Era 2 writ large. Speaking of not mattering, the Bands of Mourning proved to be underwhelming. Despite being at the center of so much drama, they ended up being somewhat of a nothing burger when it is revealed that they've been drained of power. If Sanderson is planning on using them again in one of the future eras of Mistborn, then I'll be more forgiving of this reveal. But if it does turn out that the Bands of Mourning are useless, then we have to once again acknowledge that Sanderson has a bad habit of getting ahead of himself and needing to nerf or remove concepts that are way too powerful in his story. I generally like the main plot lines for the cast and where each character ends up. Wax acknowledging the Lawbringer inside of him, but also saying goodbye to that side of his life is a great bow on his story. Wayne winding up the hero who saves the city and the world of Scadrial is more than he deserves, but a good end to his particular character arc. Marasi choosing to reject the Ghostbloods and serve the people in the light of day is the best way to resolve her story, but the preview we get into Kelsier's gang makes me very excited for the promised Mistborn Era 3. But everything is wrapped up too nicely, and that is in large part due to Sanderson not having planned for Mistborn Era 2 when he first started developing the Mistborn series. This is definitely a book that feels more like it exists to move pieces on a board into their proper place, rather than conclude the match that had been playing out. That was to be expected to some extent, but I wish it didn't feel so obvious by the time I finished reading. Part of it also has to do with the fact that I have to compare the finale of Mistborn Era 1 to 2, which is a little unfair to The Lost Metal. The Hero of Ages has one of the best and biggest conclusions in the entire Cosmere, literally world-changing in its final pages, whereas The Lost Metal's happy ending is that it closes out on a more peaceful note. Leaving me with my last real complaint, which is that the set are defeated a little too easily in this book. Given how much time and resources they invested into their invasion of Scadrial, it seems like they gave up on their invasion a little too easily. Now, if they come back with a vengeance and prove to be a major antagonist in a future era of Mistborn, great, I'll change my mind on this. But if that is the last we see of the set and their plans to conquer Scadrial, then Mistborn Era 2 would have been better had it been more disconnected instead of trying to tie everything together with this largely useless antagonistic group. And with that, we bid farewell to Mistborn Era 2. Onwards to Ghostbloods, and here's to hoping that our own world doesn't get blown to smithereens before it comes out. Going into this project, I was a little nervous. Just because a person is good at storytelling in one medium doesn't mean they're good at it in another. Furthermore, Brandon Sanderson explains in the introduction of the White Sand Omnibus that this was his very first story he developed, having started working on it during his LDS church mission to South Korea. As someone who also wrote a novel during my P days while serving in Argentina, producing a work that isn't very good, I didn't have high hopes going into White Sands. Well, I was surprised in some ways and right on the money in others. White Sand is a fantastic story, but one that is hampered instead of helped by being told in a graphic novel format. White Sand takes place on the tidally locked world of Taldane, resulting in one side being endless day and the other enduring an endless night. The story primarily follows the story of two characters, one of whom is a recurring figure throughout the Cosmere. Chrysala, though known primarily in later Cosmere stories as Chris, gets her introduction in White Sand. She is from the dark side of the planet, but comes to the day side in hopes of recruiting the Sandmasters to help her fight off the Dynasty, the empire that dominates her homeland. One problem: by the time Chris reaches the Sandmasters, they've been largely wiped out. They happen upon one of the few survivors, Kenton, the son of the previous leaders of the Sandmasters. Kenton is less powerful than the other Sandmasters, but has far greater control over his abilities, and is also hoping to revitalize an organization that has grown fat and lazy over the years. Well, this will be his chance, because he must restore the reputation of the Sandmasters in the eyes of the people, or the government of the Dayside will dissolve the Sandmasters. I can now see why, when given the choice, this was the first story that Sanderson jumped to when given the chance to continue one of his abandoned works. White Sand has a fantastic story, with one of the best cast of characters outside of the Stormlight archive. Chris falls into the standard women tropes that Sanderson relies on too much when writing female protagonists, but the other main female character, Ias, is one of Sanderson's best. Bayan, Auric, Nilto, Delius, and many other secondary characters shine within this story as well, making me sad that it is unlikely we'll see most of these characters again. Now, something that needs to be mentioned is that unlike Sanderson's other novels, this really isn't a solo effort. Besides the many artists who contributed to this comic, Brandon Sanderson also developed the plot with the help of co-author Rick Hoskin. What's impressive is that White Sand feels like a Sanderson story through and through, to the point I never would have guessed Sanderson wrote the script with the help of another person. While it's hard to say how much help he got, credit should absolutely go to Rick Hoskin for being able to work with Sanderson and maintain the overall feel that is associated with stories set within the Cosmere. There are three problems that I have with White Sand. The first is the inconsistent artwork. In American comics, it is common to see artists swap out over the course of a series, but even mid-volume, the art style would totally change. I would be more forgiving if they could have maintained the same artist at least for each volume, but given that the individual chapters were not sold separately as individual issues, it was moderately irritating to see so many art styles for the same series. I mentioned at the start that I was worried about how Sanderson's writing style would translate to a comic style. The answer? Not well. White Sand is going to be amazing when it comes out as a traditional novel, because the story as it was told didn't work well in the comic format. Sanderson is known for being too wordy, and that is doubly true here. Comics also tend to be more action-heavy, but sometimes you can read entire chapters in White Sand that are nothing but characters talking to one another. That's great for a novel, but does not make for a great graphic novel. In fact, I think some of the action scenes are pretty subpar, though I do think that part of it has to do with the script and the lack of variety when it came to who the main characters fought against. My final complaint, which is more of a backhanded compliment, is being annoyed at where the story ends. White Sand concludes the story arc for Kenton, but Chris's story has just begun when we meet her. Did she succeed in freeing her people and defeating Emperor Skathan? What prompted her to leave the planet Taldane? And what will lead Bayon to join the 17th Shard? Especially after he discovered his ability to control sand, much like the Sandmasters of the Dayside. White Sand is a story that is on top of my list for wanting to see a follow-up from, But when it does get a sequel, it's a story that should be told with a book, not a graphic novel. This is going to be my single most controversial entry on this list. I don't think Tress of the Emerald Sea is a very good book, but to explain why, you need to understand something about my tastes. Let's talk about The Princess Bride and Chocolate Chip Mint Ice Cream. The Princess Bride is in my top 5 favorite movies of all time. While there is no such thing as perfect art, there is very little I would change about The Princess Bride. That's a problem, because the old adage is true: if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Now let's talk about ice cream. Chocolate chip mint is my favorite flavor, to the point that it's the only one I eat when I go buy ice cream 9 out of 10. If I do switch things up, it's usually because I just want to add more condiments like fudge or syrup to a chocolate chip mint base. The real important part about it, however, is the color. Chocolate chip mint should look green, and while you can make chocolate chip mint that isn't green, it just isn't as enjoyable to eat even if the flavor is exactly the same. Tress of the Emerald Sea is a gender-swapped version of The Princess Bride. The premise is that Tress is an ordinary girl living on an island with her best friend and burgeoning lover Charlie. Charlie is taken away so he can be married off to a princess, and while he continues to write to Tress, he goes missing after being sent off into the midnight sea. Upon receiving a ransom note for Charlie, whom everyone writes off as a goner, Tress herself leaves the island in hopes of rescuing her beloved. So why doesn't Tress work for me? I phrase my question like that because the truth of art is that you can't make it for everyone. Something that works for one person might not work or even be offensive to another. That's why there's no such thing as objective art, with the goal of art being not so much to try and please everyone, but to try and please people with similar beliefs and tastes as ourselves. The Princess Bride works because it is the ultimate boy fantasy. The dashing hero who becomes a pirate, a master of brawn and the brain, a genius with the sword and in matters of science, a man who is an inspiring hero but also a dashing rogue, the boy who wins the heart of his childhood love but is also the man who has to save his woman. The framing device of The Princess Bride is that it is a story that a grandfather is reading to his grandson, and it works because this is the story that your average boy would love. Sanderson explains that the seeds of this story came about during a watch party he had with his family for The Princess Bride. Brandon's wife Emily complained about Princess Buttercup's role in the movie, that she is rather passive in comparison to the other main characters, including not doing anything when Wesley was kidnapped by pirates. The end result is a story in which the woman sets out to rescue her man, instead of The Princess Bride, where it is the man who sets out to save his woman. And unfortunately for me, that is enough of a change to ruin the core of what makes The Princess Bride work. To some, that's a radical change. To others, it's a minor one. But whether it is a fundamental change to the core of what makes chocolate chip mint what it is, or simply a change in the food dye that turns it from emerald green to white, the end result is something I cannot fully enjoy because it is a second-rate pass at one of my favorite things in the world. Even so, I would have rated Tress of the Emerald Sea higher if it wasn't for the fact that the book features some of the worst side characters Sanderson has ever put to print. I get that he was trying to emulate The Princess Bride in making fun, more light-hearted characters, but Fort, Anne, and Soleil are uninteresting and contribute to one of the worst scenes that Brandon Sanderson has ever written. So in the lead up to the final battle, Tress meets with the dragon Zesis. During their negotiations, Tress ends up asking for 3 small gifts, consisting of a communication tablet for Fort, glasses for Anne, and information that will help Soleil track down her father. These 3 gifts transform the lives of these 3 characters, and helps them all put their talents to good use that turns the tide of the final battle of the sorceress. I hate this finale. I hate how the arcs for these three side characters get wrapped up so neatly with just a few simple gifts that somehow resolve most of their problems in life. Anne goes from being a poor shot to an expert cannoneer almost instantly the moment she is given glasses. Fort, who despite being deaf for most of his life, is rendered almost useless when he doesn't have his communication board. As for Soleil, much of her personality revolves around her father, making her a poor imitation of everyone's favorite Spaniard, Inigo Montoya. This is starting to turn into a ramble, so let me get to the point. Do I think Tress of the Emerald Sea is a bad book? Number. I actually think there are more good things going for it than bad. But it does feel like a book that is fine-tuned for a certain kind of reader that isn't me, which in itself is fine. Art doesn't have to be for everyone, and power to the people who say that this is their favorite Sanderson novel. This isn't a Rhythm of War situation, which I think most people will find disappointing. And while I was disappointed by Tress, part of the sting is taken away by how much I love the next release in the Cosmere. It's time for me to gush about Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. I was concerned in the days leading up to the release of Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. I just described how disappointed I was with Tress in the last segment, and while it isn't part of the Cosmere, I did give Frugal Wizard a shot. I hated that book so much that I gave up on reading it about a quarter of the way through, so the Secret Project lineup really wasn't working out for me. Imagine my surprise then that Yumi and the Nightmare Painter would end up being my favorite book within the entire Cosmere. Yumi and the Nightmare Painter is a book trying to do many things, and it does the vast majority of them well. The premise is that it follows two characters, consisting of Yumi, a traveling priestess who summons spirits to help her people by stacking rocks, and Nicaro, the painter mentioned in the book's title, who defeats evil spirits by painting them. An incident occurs that causes the two souls to be tethered to one another, with Painter taking over Yumi's body in her reality, while Yumi swaps places with Painter in his. Trying to solve the mystery of this tether, and the hijinks that ensue from this Freaky Friday-like situation, makes for one of the funniest stories that Sanderson has ever written, and also one of the more heartfelt and romantic. Yumi and the Nightmare Painter was also oddly prophetic, with much of the book discussing the nature of what is art, especially when we now live in a world where AI-powered machines are capable of feeding, emulating, and regurgitating the art we humans make. This issue has only grown more concerning and prevalent with each passing month, making Yumi feel more important and relevant to read because of it. The pacing is great. The magic system is one of Sanderson's best. The romance is genuine, and humor is top-notch. Is there anything more I can say to sell you on this novel? When it comes to describing works of fiction, I generally believe that good works are self-evident, and don't need their virtues described in laborious detail. The less you know going into them, the better, so please, if you haven't read Yumi and the Nightmare Painter yet, go and do it already. But for those of you who have, you might be wondering what else I have to say. If I have any criticisms of what I think is the best book in the Cosmere, I do. But while they don't take away too much from how much I love Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, they are worth addressing, if only because these criticisms speak to some of Sanderson's greater weaknesses as a whole. The first is that Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, for as good as it is really just Sanderson retelling the story of Final Fantasy X. Well, not just a retelling, but almost beat for beat the same story, to the point that he barely skirts the line of plagiarism. For me, that meant I already guessed at what the big reveal would be, what the main antagonist would be, and how the story would end before I even hit the halfway point of the story. Fortunately, I don't love Final Fantasy X even half as much as I do The Princess Bride, so Yumi and the Nightmare Painter worked for me where Tress and the Emerald Sea did not. Here's where my concern comes in. Sanderson openly talked about how much Yumi was influenced by Final Fantasy X, which is his favorite Final Fantasy. I mean, even the main character's name is inspired by Yuna, the name of the main character from Final Fantasy. What I take issue with is that Sanderson hasn't been clear just how much influence he took from the greater world of Final Fantasy X. What am I getting at? The story of Final Fantasy X doesn't stop with the ending of 10. It continues on in 10-2, and several other side stories that have been released over the years, all of which greatly expand on the lore and world of Final Fantasy X. Sanderson himself has stated that he has only completed 10, but that he never really got into 10-2 or the other Final Fantasy X adjacent projects. But the way that Painter brings Yumi back to life in his reality at the end of the book is a pretty close beat-for-beat copy of how Final Fantasy X-2 ends. The rise of advanced machines that would go on to destroy those they serve, along with the main protagonists being sent back into the past, is what happens in both Yumi and the Nightmare Painter and Final Fantasy X 2.5. So now I can get to my point. Yumi and the Nightmare Painter seems to take a lot of material from works that Sanderson supposedly hasn't touched. If that's true, then he really should have taken some more time brushing up on the lore and stories of every Final Fantasy X work of media before writing Yumi and the Nightmare Painter. If Sanderson did do that, and that's why the two are so similar, then he should have done more to change Yumi to not make it so similar to the world of Final Fantasy X. Oh, and even if he didn't take these ideas from the greater universe of Final Fantasy X, the plot twist of body switching the past and future is absolutely taken from Your Name. I haven't read it, but apparently Hikaru no Go was a huge inspiration for this story as well, leaving me to wonder if there's a single original idea from this novel. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. I realize it might seem unfair that I'm blasting Sanderson for this, no matter how directly inspired he was or not, but that's the problem with making works of art that are directly inspired and are based on other media. It's not just the danger of direct plagiarism, but even unintentional similarities wind up making your work look suspect. None of this directly took away from my enjoyment of Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, however. Good artists copy, great artists steal, or so the saying goes. That said, Yumi and the Nightmare Painter finally helped me realize a problem that affects most of Sanderson's books. A weakness in his writing that is present in just about everything except for Mistborn Era 2. Sanderson creates way too many side characters in most of his novels, and his stories suffer for them. So in Yumi and the Nightmare Painter, each of the main characters have their own side characters that help Yumi and Painter understand both each other and the realities they come from better. Yumi's main point of contact is her warden, Li Yun, and her two attendants, while Painter's point of contact in his reality is split across a group of 4 people that are his friends. The Yumi side of the reality works better than the Painter side of reality by really focusing just on Yumi's relationship with her warden, Li Yun. You get a much better understanding of them both as characters than you do when interacting with Painter's entire gang of friends. While adding more characters may make a world feel more well-rounded, I do believe Yumi and the Nightmare Painter would have worked more if the gang had been combined more. If Painter only had 1 or 2 of his ex-friends to interact with instead of 4 of them. That's an issue I'll be discussing more in depth at the end of this video. For now, Let's put the finishing touch on this segment by giving Yumi and the Nightmare Painter its well-deserved rating. The Sunlit Man is proof that Brandon Sanderson and George R.R. Martin share some artistic tendencies. I mean that as a compliment and an insult, but I'll explain why in a moment. The Sunlit Man is the fourth and final release in Sanderson's original secret project Kickstarter. Whereas Mistborn Era 2 was Western adjacent, The Sunlit Man is flat out a Western. The story goes that Sigzil, now going by the name of Nomad, is wandering the universe on the run from the Night Brigade. They wish to capture him so they can use him as a way to track down Hoyd and the Dawnshard, with Nomad forced to constantly jump from planet to planet to avoid being captured. One such jump brings him to a very strange world that forces its inhabitants to constantly run from the sunlight, for anything caught in daylight is vaporized from the world's intense heat. The Sunlit Man is interesting in many ways. The premise is more unique than nearly anything Sanderson has written before, providing for some intense pacing that caused me to read the entire book in one day. Nomad is unlike any of the protagonists Sanderson has written before, offering more emotional depth and complexity than I expected from Sigzil. Whereas the side characters are hit or miss in the Cosmere, they serve both the plot and Nomad's character well, especially when it comes to the Spren Auxiliary. The main villain is pretty dumb, but I'm more willing to give this a pass compared to Sanderson's other novels, because your typical Western really does need a black hat to root against. When it comes to my criticisms of this book, it's not so much the book itself that annoys me, inasmuch as when it was released. Chronologically, The Sunlit Man is one of the books that takes place in the far future of the Cosmere. At the time of release, it came out between books 4 and 5 of the Stormlight Archive. This is a problem for several reasons. First, The Sunlit Man absolutely spoiled aspects of Wind and Truth. There weren't any major spoilers that ruined a blind reading experience of Stormlight 5, but here are deductions I was able to make because I read The Sunlit Man first. In fact, while I greatly enjoyed Nomad and his story in The Sunlit Man, I thought his chapters were some of the worst in Wind and Truth, because I spent most of my time reading his chapters wondering how Sigzil would wind up becoming who he is depicted as in The Sunlit Man. However, I don't think that releasing The Sunlit Man after Stormlight 5 would have fixed this complaint. I think I wouldn't have been completely happy unless The Sunlit Man came out after the entire Stormlight Archive subseries is done. Let's finally talk about George R.R. Martin. Contrary to what people have been saying, Martin is not a slow writer. Yeah, he can't match Sanderson with his output, but Martin has worked on and released plenty of material since A Dance with Dragons came out in 2011. That's kind of the problem, though, that Martin is willing to work on anything that isn't the book people want the most from Martin. My feelings after finishing The Sunlit Man, and frankly the secret projects as a whole, is that Sanderson was indulging the same bad habits as George R.R. Martin. The Way of Kings released in 2010, while Wind and Truth ultimately came out in 2024. That means that it took 14 years just to reach the midway point of the Stormlight Archives, a series that probably won't resume until 2030 at the earliest. I'm not a fan of this kind of release schedule. It makes it harder to enjoy other stories, like The Sunlit Man, when I know that by working on projects like this, it'll take longer for me to see the conclusion of something else that the author has promised to deliver. Ratings and rankings of art are entirely subjective, our enjoyment of which affected by reasons good and petty. This is my petty complaint. As a solitary work of art, The Sunlit Man is absolutely one of the best novels set within the Cosmere. I really don't have any major knocks against it, apart from it featuring one of Sanderson's worst villains. But instead of a 9 out of 10, I'm knocking it down another point because it does feel like a side diversion, a read-and-forget appetizer meant to keep the fans satiated while they wait for the main course. and I don't like appetizers, especially appetizers that spoil the main meal. Love it or hate it. That was the general consensus I saw online when Wind and Truth first came out, which I suppose should have been expected given how important of a book this is. Wind and Truth is not only the halfway point for the Stormlight Archive, but also represents what will presumably be the halfway point for the Cosmere and Brandon Sanderson's career. Assuming he lives out his days to write all of the stories he wants to tell, Wind and Truth will be the midway point as he transitions from classical fantasy stories to more modern and even space-age fantasy. So how do I feel about it? It's good. It's fine. Having now sat on this book for exactly a year, my conclusion is that while there are some serious problems with it, I think it does its job well enough to close off the first half of the Stormlight Archive, though I can't say I'm excited to see what comes next. Before we get into the specific character arcs and whether they delivered, we have to talk about the Thunderclast-sized problem with Wind and Truth. Sanderson's pacing and unwillingness to condense his storytelling got completely out of control with this book. Wind and Truth is nearly 500,000 words long, and yet it is a story that's supposed to cover only 10 days of events that take place on Roshar. Of those 10 days, only a couple are actually that meaningful, with much of the book spending way too much time in preparation for the climax. Journey before destination. That has been the tagline for the Stormlight Archive, an important refrain that many characters repeat as conventional wisdom. I thought it was an amusing phrase when I first read it, but I've come to hate it because it can be used to justify some of Sanderson's worst habits. The journey doesn't matter if the destination doesn't live up to the costs suffered along the way. Hawaii is one of my favorite places in the world, but how much I enjoy it does depend on whether I managed to get there in a single flight that only lasted 6 hours, or if I had multiple delays and layovers that extended my traveling to 16 hours. I truly believe that a third to even a half of Wind and Truth could have been cut or condensed to make this a better paced and more thrilling read. But to explain why, we need to discuss the structure of this book. This is the story of the 10 days leading up to the final confrontation between Dalinar and the current host of Odium, Taravangian. Thanks to a loophole included in their agreement, whatever each side holds on to going into the Contest of Champions will decide how much the Fallen King and his destructive shard can hold on Roshar. The book thus follows 3 separate arcs. There is the War arc, which tells the story of how the war is progressing across the world with characters like Adolin, Sizzle, and Jasna doing their best to defend their allies and the lands their forces have retained. There's the Herald arc, in which Kaladin and Szeth go to Shinovar and ultimately resolve the issues afflicting their mental health along with treating themselves. Finally, there is the Past arc, in which an incident involving Dalinar trying to visit the spiritual realm causes several of the main characters to relive the past of Roshar and discover its true history. Let's start with my favorite part of the book. The actual war fought in the 10 days leading up to the Contest of Champions is awesome. The strategies involved, the back and forth between the two sides as each of them surprise the other, the victories and defeats that these characters suffer. I'm also someone who believes the Jasna debate turned out great, so I don't have much to complain about when it comes to this side of the book. But here I have more complaints. Sigzil's arc suffered because I already read the Sunlit Man. Like I said earlier in this video, it took away much of the tension regarding his character. Fortunately, this part of the book can be fixed by simply telling fans to read the Sunlit Man after Wind and Truth, but there is one character who won't be as easily fixed. Adolin : So Adolin grew to be one of my favorite characters with each passing book, and upon learning that much of Wind and Truth would be from his viewpoint, I was thrilled as one of his fanboys. His chapters were some of the best within the book. Or at least they were until Adolin loses his damn leg. Jaime friggin' Lannister! When I first read the Stormlight Archive, I was worried that Adolin was just discount Jaime Lannister, and as soon as I saw that Adolin was a viewpoint character, I made a bet with myself that Adolin was going to be maimed in some way as befalls Jaime in A Song of Ice and Fire. He might not have lost his dueling hand, but losing a leg was a twist I saw from a mile away. That's bad enough, that Adolin really is just following Jaime's character arc, but I'm even more annoyed at the fact that Sanderson quickly undoes Adolin's injury with the formation The Unoathed. I have a huge problem with fiction in which characters lose a limb but are quickly able to compensate it with some sort of artificial replacement, and as dumb as it is in Star Wars, it is just as dumb here. The Unoathed also touch on the problems I have with the main theme of the book, but that's a can of worms we'll open later. So let's talk about Roshar's favorite therapist, Kaladin Stormblessed, and the time him and Szeth spent in Shinovar. I can't say I'm really surprised by how their character arcs concluded. Szeth could either die or make peace with himself, and I guessed that Kaladin was going to become the herald that saved all the other heralds around the halfway point of Wind and Truth. I think these are satisfying conclusions to their character arcs, and I do find much of the material surrounding them interesting, but it is weird how disconnected the events on Shinovar are from everything else going on in Wind and Truth. This is partially due to the development of Oathbringer. If you think back to what I said during that segment of the video, then you'll remember me explaining that Szeth was originally the flashback character for that novel, not Dalinar. Making Dalinar the focus of Oathbringer made that book better, but Wind and Truth suffers as a result. Szeth is still great, and by story's end he actually made it onto my top 5 favorite Stormlight Archive characters. But man, Dalinar really gets the short end of the stick in Wind and Truth. The war arc is great, and the Herald stuff in Shinovar is good, but this book suffers a great deal with all of the time spent in the past as Dalinar and company discover the true history regarding the world of Roshar. The Stormlight Archives progressively reveals more about Roshar with each passing novel. Unfortunately, the planet actually becomes less and less interesting to me with each new revelation, and the reveals themselves become less and less impactful. The history of Roshar is much like peeling an onion, where each layer is smaller and thinner than the last. Much of what is revealed in Wind and Truth about Roshar could already be inferred in previous novels, so to spend so much time on getting to the core was deeply boring and unsatisfying. Especially because I fundamentally do not care about the grand reveal that humans screwed over the singers. When developing the Stormlight Archives, Sanderson has explained that the Alethi are based on the invading Mongolians at their peak. Gavilar Kholin was effectively a stand-in for the great conqueror Genghis Khan, and much of the story of the Stormlight Archives is based upon the fall of the Mongolian Empire following the death of Genghis. The Stormlight Archives, then, is largely a story about imperialism and post-colonialism. Except, I'm not so sure that the series actually has anything that interesting to say about these topics. Not in any meaningful way. Not in any way that made me change or reevaluate my personal beliefs. Though once again, how much you like this aspect of the series is going to depend on your general feelings towards the singers. What I'm even more mixed on is the nature of oaths. Much of the Stormlight Archives is focused on the concept of honor, the shard who gives power to the Knights Radiant who stand against Odium and his forces. Dalinar has been defined by his sense of honor and obligation to follow through on his oaths, and it is from this devotion to honor that we get many of the best moments in the early part of the series. In Wind and Truth, Sanderson does tackle the difficult conundrum of what is true honor. What happens when honor is at odds with the oaths that we have sworn? By story's end, Dalinar, who effectively became honor incarnate during Oathbringer, ultimately resolves the climax of the story by becoming the man who throws away the power of honor by becoming the Oathbreaker. I understand and agree with the principle that Sanderson is presenting, even if I don't like the way in which he presents it. Ultimately, true honor means serving the greater good, to do what we can to uphold true virtue, even if we must debase ourselves from time to time to do it. In real life, this might play out as someone who rejects the laws, wisdom, and conventional morality of man in order to uphold and serve the laws, wisdom of God. The God of mercy and love is also the same God who sometimes orders his children to completely and utterly destroy that which he despises. Whether it be in the form of Abraham telling a lie, to Nephi beheading a drunken man so he might obtain the records of his people. But Adonalsium is dead in the Cosmere, and the beings who have picked up his shards are such imperfect beings they nowhere near deserve to be worshipped as gods. And no, I do not subscribe to the belief that one still has a responsibility to adhere to moral integrity in a universe where there is no God. There is some sort of higher existence in the Cosmere given the nature of the spiritual realm, but for better and worse, Sanderson has done little to explain the true theology of the Cosmere. So to whom is honor owed in the Cosmere? The unoathed would make the case that one's allegiance is owed only to oneself, that it is better to serve according to one's will and a shared cause rather than out of duty or obligation. If such is the case, then we are all little better than mercenaries, which would make this a good time to mention Mercenary Publishing. Or maybe not. The reason why I'm so mixed on this part of Wind and Truth, and why I'm struggling to reach a conclusion, is because there isn't one. The Stormlight Archives is only halfway over, and there is clearly much more to tell to this story. What is the true worth of honor and oaths is clearly a point that will be continued on in the future, and whether Adolin continues to lead the unoathed or comes to realize his shortcomings remains to be seen. After all, his murder of Cetius still hasn't really been addressed, so toss it onto the pile of 100 different plot points that might come up in the second half of the Stormlight Archive. A future that, by the end of Wind and Truth, I'm only moderately excited for? Here's why. After all the good and bad, Wind and Truth is just fine. Going into it, I expected this to be a huge turning point for the series, an equivalent to the endings of either Star Wars Episode 3 or 6. Wind and Truth should have wrapped up many of its biggest storylines, while also planting the seeds for a radically different world going forward. It does some of this, but also fails in many regards. Of the main characters, Dalinar is the only one that dies, and while his story is technically done, he will also be coming back in a way due to the ghost Blackthorn that Odium has created. As for the rest of the cast, Shallan, Adolin, Jasnah, and Renarin clearly have more to their story that needs to be told. Zet's story seems pretty done, while I'm not sure if Kaladin himself will play a huge role in the story going forward or not. As for Roshar, much of it is now covered in Voidlight, but if the first half of the Stormlight Archives was about fighting Odin and his forces, well, guess what the second half is about? I don't think I would be as irritated by how things end if I knew the second half of Stormlight was coming out sooner, but I'll genuinely be shocked if we see Stormlight 6 before 2030 or within 5 years of this video. It might not even be until closer to 2035 or 10 years from this video before we see it. There is also the problem that Sanderson promised the second half of Stormlight would be a pretty big departure from what came before, that it would be based on an idea he had for a tabletop RPG that he saved to use in his books instead. I'm still waiting to hear the explanation for that, because I don't really understand how Roshar at the end of Wind and Truth is any different from your typical Final Fantasy or many other fantasy games that have come out in the 21st century. Wishing what could have been is a bad habit to have as a reader, but while I was reading Wind and Truth, this is the direction I was hoping for. I thought that the story would be about the consequences of victory, an examination of what happens when the good guys win but can't get along. Many empires fall apart due to civil wars, and I thought the story might end with the mutual destruction of Dalinar and Taravangian. This would lead to conflict between the surviving members of House Kholin, all of whom would have a different vision to Roshar. Who would inherit the mantle as ruler? Adolin is the firstborn son of Dalinar, but his hands are still wet with the blood of the murdered Setius. Jasna is the eldest heir of Gavanor, but is despised by much of her own people, and also left mentally broken by the end of Wind and Truth. Renarian is odd in many ways, and how will his people react to finding out he is in a homosexual relationship with their hated enemy, the Singers? Thanks to Odium, Gavanor has come of age, but as a former servant of Odium, can he be trusted with the throne? An epic story of how former friends and heroes turn on one another once their mutual enemy has been destroyed would have made for an interesting tale. Alas, it doesn't seem like it's the story that Brandon Sanderson wants to tell. Perhaps someone else will tell a story with such a fascinating premise one day. Cough, cough. Isles of the Emberdark is the best novel to end this series ranking on, at least for now. This book represents the best and worst of Brandon Sanderson, showcasing that while he has become a better writer and storyteller since Elantris, he has picked up a few bad habits over the years that he really needs to get rid of if he wishes to cement himself as the king of modern English fantasy. Like many other projects Sanderson has worked on, the story of how Isles of the Emberdark came to be is as interesting as the final book itself. Isles of the Emberdark is actually an expanded continuation of the earlier short story Sixth of the Dusk. This novel is split up into 4 parts, with the first part being a slightly updated Sixth of the Dusk. The second part is the introduction to new character Starling, while parts 3 and 4 tells the story of the two working together to uncover the secrets of a mysterious island found within the Emberdark. Dusk is great, and the elements he brings to the story are both intriguing and unique. I am someone who has spent quite a bit of time in Hawaii, so I find stories that are influenced by Polynesian culture to be hit or miss. Some have said that Isles of the Emberdark to be very similar to another piece of fiction, Moana, a problem that nearly every secret project Sanderson has worked on is plagued with. I'll give it more of a pass this time since the original novella Sixth of the Dusk came out years ago, but more importantly, because Dusk and his plotline just works. Stories regarding Polynesian culture inevitably turn into the story of colonization, a theme that was already brought up in the Stormlight archive. However, I think Sanderson handles it much better here. There is an acknowledgement of that which is lost with outside influence and modernization, but also the acceptance that good things come from it as well. It is a topic full of debate, one that requires careful consideration, and Sanderson ultimately handles it very well with Isles of the Emberdark. If this was just the story of Dusk, I would praise Isles of the Emberdark as one of the best stories he has published within the Cosmere. However, this is a book of 2 halves, and for as much as I enjoyed the Dusk portions, I was really let down by Starling's portions of the book. Starling should have been significantly more interesting. She is our first dragon protagonist, and anyone who follows Brandon Sanderson should know how much he loves dragons. The dragons he's introduced in the Cosmere up to this point are some of the most fascinating characters within the Cosmere, so I once again made the mistake of getting too excited, of setting my expectations too high when I heard Isles of the Emberdark would feature a dragon as a protagonist. But what happened? Sanderson committed the worst sin a writer could commit. Starling isn't a bad character, but she is absolutely boring. The Starling chapters are a slog to get through. I've heard people compare her sections to Guardians of the Galaxy or Firefly, but while I get why someone might make that comparison, it is Guardians of the Galaxy done poorly. While I loved pretty much everything about the Dusk chapters, I don't like really anything about the Starling chapters. First, Starling is a dragon who is having much of her power repressed. What does that leave her as? A human with some above-average physical abilities, but basically human in every other way. I've grown to dislike aliens more and more over the years while reading fiction, and part of the reason is because of characters like Starling. If you're going to make a character that isn't human but looks human and acts human in every significant way, then you're being an ass by trying to have your cake and eat it too. Starling's main dilemma in the book is that she is trying to save her crew after they've all been captured by Dajer and his soldiers with the Malwish Empire. Work for them, and Starling can free herself from the bindings that repress her dragon powers. But doing so practically dooms her crew to certain death. She should have taken the deal. Guardians of the Galaxy, Firefly, and other stories that feature a motley crew who just barely tolerate one another long enough to save the day work because of their dynamic characters and the interesting, even evolving relationships they have with each respective member of the crew. Yes, each of the crew has their small distinguishing quirks, but despite having read this novel just a few months ago, I could not tell you almost anything about them save for Naz, who has appeared in previous Sanderson stories and is now a Shade. Correction. I also remember Chrysalis. She is a Sleepless and is easy to remember because everyone else hates her. And by everyone, I mean both the crew that work with Naz, the Malwish soldiers, and me. I'm still aboard the Sleepless hate train, after all. Speaking of the Malwish soldiers, we have approached levels of stupid villains that make Cobra Commander and his troops seem smart and nuanced by comparison. If I had a nickel for every time Sanderson made the protagonist criticize the antagonist for being a fascist, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot, but it's damn annoying that it's happened twice. This was a major complaint that people had about the Sunlit Man, only for Sanderson to turn around and make the main villain of Sixth of the Dusk, Dajer, a carbon copy of the main antagonist of the last secret novel, The Cinder King. So Isles of the Emberdark is hit or miss. There are things I love about it, and things I absolutely hated. It is a story with a strange origin, and while it is a novel I am happy to have read, I don't think it's a necessary one that would jump to the top of my list when recommending books for people to read. The novel does leave me intrigued to see the future of the Cosmere, but I can't say I'm excited about the idea of seeing Starling and the crew of the Dynamic in another story, even if Sixth of the Dusk now counts himself among their crew. With all that said, congratulations. We have now discussed every major release set within the Cosmere. The individual rankings are as follows, so take a moment to check them out. Have a book whose ranking you disagree with? Then please leave a comment telling me what you would change in your Cosmere ranking list. But with the individual releases taken care of, we can move on to the final portion of the video. Having now reviewed every single book set within the Cosmere, let's talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Brandon Sanderson's writing, and ultimately, what I want to see from him in the Cosmere going forward. Here's a bold statement. Brandon Sanderson is the best living English fantasy author. I might have been critical of some of his books, but his overall batting average is absolutely insane. There are few series that can match both the quality and consistency of Brandon Sanderson when compared against the Cosmere. George R.R. Martin is better at the art of writing than Sanderson, but it doesn't matter how good you are if you don't come out with anything. While others might like Joe Abercrombie, Jim Butcher, Guy Gavriel Kay, I don't think their average output matches up to Sanderson. Want to know the highest praise I can give Brandon Sanderson? If you compare the average score of a story set in the Cosmere and the average score of a movie set in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, I would make the argument that Sanderson's average book is better than the average MCU project. So what makes Brandon Sanderson so great? It really is because he is so good at so many different aspects of storytelling. So to keep things simple, and because this video is already going to be over 2 hours long, I'm going to focus on the top 6 things I love the most about the works of Brandon Sanderson. Let's get the obvious one out of the way first. There is no one in the world of writing right now better at developing magic systems than Brandon Sanderson. Giving characters interesting powers with proper checks in place to keep things interesting, while also showing how the magic influences the character's personality and desires, is a hard balance to maintain. Sanderson is not perfect at it, but I do struggle to think of works of fiction that come close to his mastery of magic systems. Marvel and DC, My Hero Academia, Fullmetal Alchemist, JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and Jobless Reincarnation all come to mind, but none of them come close to matching the ingenuity and uniqueness that is the Cosmere and its various magic systems. There really aren't many writers who can match Sanderson in terms of his ability to make a thrilling climax. Apart from 1 or 2 books, the finale of each of his stories makes even his worst books worth reading. He can say journey before destination as many times as he wants, but Sanderson absolutely understands the importance of sticking an ending. After Magic Systems, How to Write a Good Finale is a course that I would love to attend from Brandon Sanderson, which is why I'm glad he has posted some of his lectures for free. If you're an aspiring writer, you should absolutely watch the storytelling lectures from Brandon Sanderson on his YouTube channel. In recent years, DEI has become a dirty word in not just the world of politics, but in the world at large. Forced inclusion and tokenism has dragged down many aspects of society. Which is sad, because I sincerely believe that some level of diversity is healthy for people and culture. This extends to art, which is why Brandon Sanderson deserves credit for being able to tell such a diverse set of stories. I don't just mean diversity across genres, but diversities in the settings and types of characters featured in his books. Fantasy, especially the most famous works of fantasy, tend to largely consist of depictions heavily based on medieval Northern Europe, or on the cultures of the Arabian Peninsula. Mistborn Era 1 might as well take place in Camelot, but Mistborn Era 2 is a more modern fantasy. The Stormlight Archives is heavily influenced by Central Asia. Isles of the Emberdark is a great Polynesian-style fantasy adventure, while Yumi and the Nightmare Painter show Sanderson's appreciation for Southeastern Asian storytelling. Picking up a new Sanderson novel means a look at a new or different aspect of human culture, and he hits it out of the park 9 times out of 10. George R.R. Martin revitalized the world of adult fantasy publishing in America with A Song of Ice and Fire. As good as that series is, it is limited in part by the fact that it is so adult in nature, some of it gratuitously and unnecessarily so. The debate of how explicit stories should be is best saved for another video, but Brandon Sanderson is proof that you can write stories that can be loved by people of all ages. Just by going to the Salt Lake City airport, I've seen people waiting for their flights reading books set within the Cosmere, as young as 8 and as old as 80. The Cosmere is largely clean enough that everyone can read them, but still deep and mature enough that everyone will benefit from reading the Cosmere no matter their age. George R.R. Martin revitalized the world of adult fantasy publishing in America with A Song of Ice and Fire. As good as that series is, it is limited in part by the fact that it is so adult in nature, some of it gratuitously and unnecessarily so. The debate of how explicit stories should be is best saved for another video, but Brandon Sanderson is proof that you can write stories that can be loved by people of all ages. Just by going to the Salt Lake City airport, I've seen people waiting for their flights reading books set within the Cosmere, as young as 8 and as old as 80. The Cosmere is largely clean enough that everyone can read them, but still deep and mature enough that everyone will benefit from reading the Cosmere no matter their age. You didn't think I'd leave this off of my list, did you? Brandon Sanderson is also the undisputed king when it comes to world building in novels. I am someone who loves classical fiction, but will admit they're often self-indulgent when it comes to describing the world and setting. Meanwhile, many new books have become so tropey they often skip and skim over the important world-building details. Sanderson generally walks the careful balance of explaining what makes each of his planets and stories unique, but also making it all plot relevant so it doesn't feel like a Wikipedia article or that the book is wasting the reader's time. An artist who creates a work of art has doomed themselves because for the rest of their career the audience will always debate what is the artist's best work. Even worse, the more art that an artist produces, the easier it becomes to see what they are good at and, unfortunately, where they are deficient. I've just finished singing Sanderson's praises, so it is only right that I now list some of my biggest issues with the writing of the Cosmere and Brandon Sanderson. As with all criticism, what I see as a weakness might be a strength to you. And just because Sanderson isn't good at something doesn't mean that there are a ton of writers and artists who are better. What I'm presenting are simply issues that have continued to irritate me across the works of the Cosmere, problems that have appeared in at least 3 or more of the novels that I've read. While I have many petty and smaller complaints, I will be sticking to the 4 biggest complaints I have with the Cosmere. This is several complaints rolled into one, but Sanderson has been way too indulgent when it comes to his works over the past few releases. Whether it's because he is so respected that he doesn't feel he needs as much editorializing, or because his editors don't feel the need to correct him, the fact is that Sanderson's writing has gotten out of hand. I like world building, but Sanderson approaches the likes of The Hunchback of Notre Dame or Moby Dick with some of his narration. Some plots get dragged out way too much, and even his best books could often be improved by combining some of the side characters and speeding up the narrative progression. I complained about it several times throughout this video, but Sanderson also has a bad habit of introducing cool concepts and powers only to nerf or get rid of them because they cause him too many narrative problems. By trimming the fat and editing his stories until only the most important parts remain, many of Sanderson's worst writing habits would be fixed. He wouldn't dig so many narrative pitfalls for himself. Sanderson would improve his pacing. Readers wouldn't be as intimidated when considering his books, and we could get to his future novels even faster. This isn't just a Brandon Sanderson problem. Most male writers tend to struggle with writing male characters, especially when comparing the average female writer who has to write about men. The problem with Sanderson is that he actually does typically write good female characters, but has a bad habit of making them too similar to one another. If Sanderson is writing a female protagonist, then chances are they're going to be a type A, headstrong, boundary pusher, testing the limits of gender conventions in their society with their can-do attitude and need to prove themselves. I gushed a whole lot about Tress in this ranking video because she is so unique compared not just to other modern female heroes in literature, but even when compared to the other female protagonists within the Cosmere. Mistborn Era 3 is supposed to star a new female protagonist, one who is much more a nerd than those who came before her. So let's see if she can stand out, or if she becomes another carbon copy of the women that came before her. Some say that a story is only as good as its antagonist. I don't believe that in the slightest, and can think of many great stories with a lackluster antagonist, but it's also true that the best stories typically feature amazing villains and rivals. Brandon Sanderson does such a good job at making protagonists that it's frustrating he cannot replicate his success when it comes to creating villains. Good villains like Dyloff and Miles get killed off in the same books they're introduced. The evil shards like Odium and Ruin are too one-note to care about, and let's not give too much credit to villains who barely appear even when they're the main antagonist of the story, such as the Lord Ruler or Mr. Suit. There are many good things that Brandon Sanderson and the MCU have in common, but bad villains is a failure they both share. When you read more than 20 stories from the same author, you're going to get pretty good at guessing how their stories play out. Even so, it's almost comical just how repetitive Sanderson has become when it comes to his writing structure. As fun as it is to reach the Sanderlanche in every novel, it also means that you can spend most of the book knowing that the main characters are safe, that the biggest twists are being saved for the climax, that everything you're reading is just the calm before the storm. Even Wind and Truth, which does experiment with Sanderson's usual writing style, follows the same structure outline and fall into the same trappings as the stories that came before. With Sanderson taking a break from his usual release schedule and opting to write the entire Ghostbloods trilogy all at once, I hope he'll use this extra time to experiment more, ensuring that the start of Mistborn Era 3 feels not just fresh, but the start of a new era of Sanderson Cosmere writing. In for a penny, in for a pound. At this point, having read so many books from Brandon Sanderson's The Cosmere, I can promise you that I'll be making reviews of any new entries that will come in the years ahead. How and when the Cosmere will end, I cannot say, but if you are looking for a Cosmere reviewer, then I hope that you'll subscribe to my channel. But what is coming from the future of the Cosmere? Well, there are quite a few projects we already know about, including several eras of Mistborn and the second half of the Stormlight Archive. Even so, to bring this video to an end, I'm going to share the 3 things I want to see the most from Brandon Sanderson beyond simply improving on some of his biggest weaknesses. Thanos, Blofeld, Voldemort, Ozai, Virgil, the Emperor, Darkseid. I already discussed how Brandon Sanderson doesn't have the best villains in his stories, but something that would address this criticism and also improve the interconnectivity of the Cosmere is to introduce a shared villain. Whether it be the Teravangian Odium, the Fallen Harmony becoming Discord, Autonomy, or a brand new character, I truly believe that the Cosmere will reach new levels of excitement if we meet a series-wide villain. Alternatively, if Sanderson really doesn't want a villain for the entire Cosmere, then he should at least give Hoid a counterpart. Someone that keeps appearing to screw things up would be a fun change to the setting. A rival to freshen things up in a universe that has grown a little too predictable. This is going to be controversial, especially because I do love some of the secret projects and standalone novels that Brandon Sanderson has worked on. However, despite the praise we give him, Brandon Sanderson is still a mortal man. No, not just mortal, but one who is going to turn 50 in a couple weeks, and, without being too insulting, is clearly overweight. People certainly live longer nowadays compared to what they used to, but remember that Sanderson's early career highlight was taking over for Robert Jordan when he passed away at 58. For the Cosmere to feel complete, we absolutely need to see Mistborn Era 3 and 4, Dragonsteel, and the second half of the Stormlight Archives. Should I even mention potential sequels like those he once promised, the follow-ups to Elantris and Warbreaker? Even if Sanderson prioritizes finishing off his most popular series, he has 15 to 20 years worth of books that will probably take even longer to release because we know writers slow down as they age. If Sanderson really wants to finish his series himself and not leave someone to take over after he's dead, it's time to lock in and finish the books he has promised without diverting his attention to any other spin-offs or side projects. Now, this one isn't entirely in Sanderson's control, and also something we've seen some success on already. We've already seen one graphic novel from Brandon Sanderson, and he managed to release the Cosmere tabletop RPG for pen and paper fans in his community. These are good additions to the Cosmere universe, but they are appetizers compared to the meat and potatoes, the main meal that would be a Cosmere movie, TV show, or video game. Sanderson has talked about how hard he has tried to get these projects made, and therein lies the problem. Brandon Sanderson is a meticulous man, and someone who is deeply involved in everything related to the Cosmere. Unfortunately, his involvement means that he will either reject project proposals he isn't entirely comfortable with, or turn down projects he doesn't have the time to develop. At some point, getting something is better than getting nothing at all, even if what comes out doesn't live up to the expectations of the fans. I do think there is value in bad fiction and poor adaptations, so if Sanderson is the main obstacle in seeing adaptations of his works get made, then it's time for him to let go of some of his control so we can start seeing more Cosmere media that aren't books.
And that brings my longest video yet to a close. Thank you so much if you've actually listened all the way to the end, and a big shout out to all the other viewers who have been checking out my stuff. My channel here on YouTube has already seen far more engagement in just a couple months than I thought I would get in a whole year. That's why I wanted to make this special video, to celebrate both the channel and all of you mercenaries that have been subscribing. So what did you agree or disagree with? What are you hoping to see in the future of the Cosmere? Please leave a comment to share your thoughts, and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you're interested in hearing me talk more about books and other great stories in the future. Thanks again for listening, and catch you in the next video, Mercenary.